Just want to call this meeting of the PSTE and T&E to order. This is for the record, Corey McRae, Senator for the 45th Legislative District. I'm also joined by my colleagues from the Senate. We have Senator Doug J.J. Peters. We have Senator Saling, and Senator George Edwards will be joining us momentarily. And at this moment, before we get into agency briefings, I'd also like to recognize Delegate Carol Krim, Madam Vice Chair, if you have anything that you wanted to say at the moment.
I have no opening remarks, but thank you for asking. So I'll turn it back over to you. Yes,
ma'am. At this time, I would like to call up Andrew Gray, our budget analyst for the Department of Planning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hopefully you're now seeing the share screen coming up for the Maryland Department of Planning's analysis. This first analysis, we're talking here about the Maryland Department of Planning's operating budget. You see the overall funding changes by around $0.4 million, around $400,000, a decrease 1.6% between fiscal 21 and fiscal 22, and that's the adjusted amounts. In terms of what's happening in fiscal 21, you see there's a proposed deficiency around $65,000 in federal funds for funding that would usually come in for a budget amendment. This is to support the Jefferson Patterson Park Museum's digital outreach programming and provide for the hiring of 2 contractual full-time equivalents. In terms of cost containment, there were Board of Public Works actions July 1, 2020, reductions related to the balancing of the fiscal 21 budget as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Maryland Department of Planning's overall share of this reduction was $112,055. Now, moving on to the overview of agency spending here, what you see is that the majority, or the 34% of the overall funding is in the Management Planning Educational Outreach Program. And this primarily reflects the $5.6 million for Maryland Heritage Areas Authority grants. And there's also salaries funding in there as well. We'll be talking a little bit about more of those grants later. The next largest category of funding is the 16% for the Operations Division. This includes the Department of Information Technology Services allocation. Then the Planning, Data, and Research Program is around 13%, $3 million. And this reflects the funding for certainly salaries, and is a lot of the census and redistricting work is showing up here. And I'll just talk briefly, the 13% for the museum services reflects salary funding and also a complement of contractual full-time or equivalents. And this is work that's being done down at Jefferson Patterson Park Museum. In terms of the where it goes chart for Exhibit 2 for fiscal 22, the overall change, once again, around $400,000 decrease. Under personnel expenses, there are some increases for employee and retiree health insurance, and then regular earnings reflected there, and then reclassification funding as well. And then there are 2 positions that are abolished in the allowance, noted here as a $131,000 reduction. In terms of the other changes there, the major changes are going on in the census and redistricting area. This is funding that's going out because the census, 2020 census has now been completed, and then redistricting work is continuing. And the overall biggest change in the budget is a $375,000 reduction for the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory one-time moving and storage costs. So that funding was provided in fiscal 21. However, it's not actually been used yet because the project has not actually gone to construction bid. And therefore, that funding would either need to be reverted at the end of the year or encumbered for those expenses. In terms of personnel data, you see here, once again, the 2 position reduction between the 2 years. 2 long-term vacant positions were reduced. That includes the an administrative position, I believe, and another position as well. The remaining positions that are in the allowance that are vacant of the overall 13 positions, there are 3 that are in the reclassification process, and DLS does have a recommendation for one of those positions going forward. Moving now to the issues, just talk really briefly about the COVID-19 pandemic impact on MDP. Like a lot of agencies, MDP moved to a telework model and has been successful at doing that. It has notes that it's had a minimal impact on its operations as a result of that transition. However, the Historic Revitalization Tax Credit Program website does reflect some challenges in terms of the review time period, and that appears to be expanding. That's just something that's happened in the previous years, even before the pandemic, but it does note that there were some challenges there. In terms of the 2020 census, the census has now been completed, Maryland, we did quite well. We were 9th in the country in terms of the self-response rate, 71.2%, which is a remarkable work, and basically kind of meets MDP's goals. However, there's a little bit of confusion about the total response rate and how to compare that to previous years. And it appears there's a methodology change that doesn't allow for a kind of comparison between the 2010 census and the 2020 census. Exhibit 3 reflects here the kind of overall picture by county in terms of those self-response rates. And Carroll County, tucked away right here, had the highest rate, one of the highest rates in the country actually, for self-response rate. And this is a perennial objective that they meet. It's an excellent self-response rate. In terms of how counties did relative to the 2010 census self-response rate, you see here on the far left, Worcester and Garrett counties had the greatest percent change. And that appears to reflect the fact that those two counties are also have an adjustment because they have a lot of second homes. So it's not necessarily an apple to apples comparison between all the different counties. In terms of the counties that actually had a lower self-response rate than previously, that would be over here, Somerset, Allegheny, and then Baltimore City. And the overall national response rate is 67%. The Census grant program, Maryland Census Grant Program, 2020 grant program is $5 million that was allocated to municipalities, to counties, and to nonprofit organizations for working on getting out the message about the 2020 census. And you see here the information basically reflects that a lot of the nonprofit work was centered in the urban core. And then there's funding kind of also reflected for the other counties as well and municipalities. Then if you look at this next exhibit 5, you see that that urban core of work by nonprofits doesn't necessarily cover a lot of the low response count areas. And so that's something to kind of look at going forward is how did Maryland do in those more rural low response rate areas? Because those are areas you want to bring up for the 2030 census. But those lessons can't be learned necessarily now because we don't have the final census data. It'd be probably 2022 or so before we'll get the undercount and be able to understand really kind of what the overall picture was for the census in Maryland. In terms of the lessons learned that were conveyed by the report submitted by the Maryland Department of Planning based on the Joint Chairman's report request, they note that it'd be important to begin the procurement process earlier for the media purchase. The Maryland Complete Count Committee role, it needs to be defined in terms of the kind of relationship between the state and the Complete Count Committee. And finally, the Maryland State Data Center housed within the Maryland Department of Planning should be leveraged further in terms of its working with local jurisdictions. The Department of Legislative Services recommends that MDP comment on a methodology for determining the impact of all the types of 2020 census outreach on the self-response rate in low response rate areas and comment on how these self-response rates can be increased. Third issue here reflects redistricting status. Just really briefly, the Maryland Department of Planning has signed a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Legislative Services on data sharing of geocoded addresses for prisoners or incarcerated individuals. And there's a Maryland Citizens Redistricting Commission that was created by Governor Hogan January 12th, 2021. So this sort of the action sort of kind of going on right now. In terms of Maryland Department of Planning's ability to provide for that information and placing incarcerated individuals properly, that data is now not expected before July 31, 2021. So that will kind of delay the process of their being able to do that work. Moving now to the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority. One of the major grants, the major grant in the Maryland Department of Planning is $5.6 million provided for Maryland Heritage Areas Authority grants. And in the past, Maryland Department of Planning has had a 1-to-1 matching rate, which is still in place. But what they've done is they've changed the cash match component of that. So previously you had to have 75% of your 1-to-1 match had to be cash. So $7,500 of $10,000, say, had to be a cash match for a $10,000 grant from the state. But going forward, they've moved to now a situation where in-kind contributions can provide for that entire 1-to-1 match, which hopefully will allow for more diversity in terms of applications and actual choosing of different applications that come in. However, that does potentially reduce some of the leverage factor in terms of the money that can be expended for this purpose. Also, Maryland Heritage Areas Authority has recently completed an economic impact study of the 12 of the Maryland's 13 certified heritage areas using, well, actually that was the previous study, and they've updated that with a new study reflects a $2.4 billion annual economic impact from heritage areas. And at the time of the writing of this analysis, the information was not provided in a disaggregated form by county, but my understanding is that that information is now available in the response the Maryland Department of Planning has provided. However, DLS does recommend that MDP comment on that breakdown in terms of the funding that's kind of reflected for each of the heritage areas and how the lessons learned from that most recent economic impact study will be applied. Finally, recommended actions in the analysis are to delay one long-term vacant planner lead advanced position and funding the planning data and research program. That would be $81,528 general fund reduction. Unless there are any questions, that concludes the analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Is there any questions of anyone from the committee?
I see none on my side. I do need to point out, Mr. Chairman, that I believe Chair Macintosh has joined us today. Just want to point that out. So,
Always good to see Matt.
there she is.
Always good to see you too. Thank you very much. I'm happy to join in today and listen to the issues facing the subcommittee. It's good to see you, Madam Chair, and Senator Cray, Mr. Chairman. You always make me smile.
Same here, same here. Seeing no further questions, if we can have Secretary McCord and his team.
Make sure I'm unmuted. There you go. Can you hear me, chairs?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, chairs. I appreciate the time. Glad to be with you today. All members of the committee, thank you very much for your kind attention to our work during the census. Literally, the U.S. Census Bureau conducts a census, and our job is to promote and build up that response rate. But we didn't do it by ourselves. Every one of you and your legislative efforts and your newsletters and everything that the entire General Assembly did to promote the census, we have to thank you for. We've had partners across the state, from nonprofits to legislators to businesses to utilities. We've had all kinds of help with this. So the partnerships were critical to the success that we shared. The state plays this kind of conductor role, not taking the names, but playing conductor like in a symphony. And we couldn't have done it without each of the players doing their part as best they could. So of course I put some miles in myself, but that's just one person driving all around the state. I was in Wycomico County at an event in Wycomico County, also in Spanish Mass at Baltimore City. I was at Prince George's County handing out food and having Hispanic census takers there if people hadn't filled out the form yet. So we did work all over the state, but it was just a piece of all the work that was done. And all the work that was done by people who were interested in making sure that count came out well. And that count came out very well for us. 9th in the country under these conditions is a really, really good accomplishment. And it compares favorably to the other census. So if you look at 2020 compared to 2010, 2010 was a 69.5% response rate, self-response rate, and then 2000 is 69% self-response rate. So from 2000 to 2010, they added a 0.5%, and then from 2010 until 2020, we added 1.7% to that. So that's 3.4 times the rate we increased right there. So it was really quite significant. And as Andrew pointed out, and Andrew has been seriously interested in how this is calculated, and we've been trying to explain that the actual final numbers 2 years from now, when they do their after action report, will help refine all of these numbers. They will actually delete the non-responsive households. So when they mail it to a household and nobody actually is living there, that gets deleted from the denominator. So things will change when they have an after action report. But even when things change, you have a situation where the ability to respond online and by telephone was never available in any other census that's ever been taken. So it won't be 100% comparable, but we can get some we get some idea what's going on there. What I've asked the state data center to do is look at the low response scores. The low response score census tracts are those with a propensity, a greater propensity not to self-respond. So we've looked at those areas and tried to figure out what we can learn from those areas. And in those areas, we can tell you that when the low response score was greater than or equal to 20, there's 647 of those census tracts. And in 2010, there were 347. And we have increased 54% those low response score areas. And low response scores higher than 30%, we've increased them by 55%. So in the low response areas, we literally can say that half of those did better than they did in the previous year. So I think we are getting to the point of understanding better that we had done a really decent job, even in the low response areas. But the final results and the final numbers will really tell the tale there. But I wanted you to get the idea that from what we can tell right now, we did better even in the low response areas than we did before. And those areas are beyond the urban core. And there is a cost per capita concept to figure out how much effort and money is spent there. We will try to figure that out also once we have all the data back in from all the money that was spent by the grants program. But the concept is we did move the needle quite significantly, even in the low response score areas. So I have with me Elizabeth Hughes, the director of the Maryland Historical Trust, and Ann Raines and Greg Pierce is from the Jefferson Patterson Park Museum. They'll be able to address the issues that come up regarding those areas. But I just wanted to remind you that the self-response rates were very, very good. And it didn't happen because of me, and it didn't happen because of any one person. It was really a bunch of great partnerships that went on throughout the entire state. And some municipalities did great and some municipalities struggled. And we were trying to make sure that we provided help wherever we could to make sure that we got the best response we could. So I'll go ahead and let me see. There's the next question you have is about the heritage areas. You can see there's a chart in the response there. Elizabeth Hughes can talk to how we did that. That basically the contractor that did the work to try to study each and every heritage area to try to figure out the economic impact. That is a very large undertaking, and some of that happened during the pandemic. And we tried to make sure that we were responsive and try to make sure that the Heritage Areas Authority was able to still respond to people who were trying to get outdoors and trying to visit these sites, making sure the operating grants were available to make sure these places were still able to receive visitors and still able to be open to the public. If there's any other questions about that, I can leave that for Elizabeth, and then I will come back and talk to you again about the recommendation about the reduction of a PIN. So if Elizabeth, or any questions that you might have from Greg Pierce at the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, we have the Deputy Director Ann Raines on with us also.
Senator Saling.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for the information and for our analysts. Just one question. I know that when I went out on the polls this past year, they were out there getting the census, and they were doing a very good job. But I was just wondering, were they able, as not many polls were open, of course, this year because of the pandemic, were they able to cover all the polls and get the numbers that they believe to be at least? We want to make sure we pick them up and get as many as we can to be responsible. But did we do that? Thank you.
Well, that was not a specific objective of the Department of Planning, but many of the local governments made sure that they had people not only at the polls, but they combined voter registration and census awareness at the same time. So I was at community events where you had one table for census and another table for voter registration, reminding people that these are two important civic duties, and those civic duties go together. So it was very effective where I was able to physically witness it, and apparently it was effective in some of the other areas too.
And I agree, it was effective. I was able to talk to some of the people that were, interacting, and I think it was a good thing. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge that we've been joined by Chairman Mark Corman for T&E at this moment. And Secretary McCord, I don't believe that you were finished your presentation. Are you or are you not? I didn't hear you comment on vacancies.
No, let me go ahead and address the vacancies.
Yeah, that way we can answer all the questions at one time.
There you go. That's fine. My concern with the vacancy is we've been trying to do a good job in the pandemic. We've been trying to be effective, even though that we're working almost primarily by telework. We're still able to get the reviews done. We're still able to get the state data center working on all cylinders. When somebody needs to know how many poultry workers live in Maryland, what are their nationalities and what languages they speak, because there's a problem in Delaware, we can have that kind of information within the hour to make sure that we have the best information to make decisions. When we need the state data center, they've always been there for us, and now they're being there for the Department of Health. And we're trying to make sure that the power of the state data center has been available all along, no matter what. And we're also making sure that everything else that we do, including, and state data center is just one of these things, why this position is already in the process of being reclassified. It was a promotion from within, and I particularly take a bit of umbrage at when I promote from within to make sure that the position doesn't get cut out from under the person that just got promoted, because it would be easier to try to find somebody from the outside. But I promote from within and then try to reclassify that position and see what it really needs to do next time when we fill it. Unfortunately, the person that gets promoted does some of the old duties that they used to do, which helps us out a bit, but we still need to figure out what we need that person for. And now we're coming up into a situation where that person, those skills can be used for, I think I've detailed 5 things there. There's redistricting, we'll have online submissions and support for the independent commission as however we're requested to do that support. The second thing is the Interagency Commission on School Construction. That is, our school assets probably eclipse our highway assets when you think about all the schools that have to be maintained. So sitting on that Interagency Commission for School Construction, we're going to have to pay close attention to enrollment rates. We're looking at total cost of ownership for each of these facilities, and we need to have the ability to support that effort. And we've been supporting that effort from planning, and I can't lose that position. That's the second reason. The third reason is that we provide assistance to local election boards. There's no way to estimate how many of those precinct level geography changes might be made this time. So once the new census tracks are available, they're already available, we're already trying to load them in. Depending upon how redistricting ends up, people are going to have to make changes to the precincts. And we've been able to provide help with changing the precincts to realign the precincts with new census tracts and new census blocks. And that's help to the local election boards that this position could be helpful with. And then I say continued support to state agencies. Planning, like all the state agencies, working to support the governor's COVID relief efforts. We have the distribution of vaccines going on, as you know. We have 12.5% of the data services section of our people detailed to the health department to try to give a hand there. So we are doing what we can to help in that situation. And we're also provided assistance to the opioid task force, because that's kind of a silent problem that's been growing as the pandemic has been growing. We're trying to get a handle on that problem, get a handle on the data involved in that problem so we can target our resources to fix that problem as best we can also. So that opioid task force work, we have really, as my last line says, the state's fortunate to have great people stretched thin in places that we're continuing to do great work. And we respectfully request to retain that position because it's in the middle of being reclassified. And as soon as we get the okay, we'll be willing to hire somebody to help our team. So I really, really appreciate your full consideration of not taking that pin from the Department of Planning. So my staff is here to answer any other questions based on the analysis that Andrew did. And we thank Andrew Andrew is not only interested, he digs in and tries to make sure he's understanding it. So I have to give him credit every year, year after year, for trying to understand what we're doing in planning.
Thank you, Secretary McCord. At this moment, I'm going to see if there are any questions by any of the senators. Seeing none at this time, I do have a couple questions that I'm going to run through very, very quick, Secretary.
Okay.
On page 9, we talked about the historic revitalization tax credit program. This was a challenge last year also. I know the director, Madam Director Hughes, I talked to her, I want to say the fourth quarter of 2019 in reference to the slow progress that some folks were having in reference to getting the tax credit program. Could you comment on, I guess, whether the supervisor position for the tax credit program was filled and how many positions are vacant in that specific part of the agency, I want to say?
Sure. So there are two positions that have been vacant for quite some time. The contractual tax credit reviewer became vacant in, I think it was February of 2020, and we had a failed recruitment there. We had interviewed someone when we were able to offer the position. They declined it because the salary wasn't up to their expectations. So we then had to re-recruit. We now have that position filled, and the person is starting this week, I believe. So the contractual tax credit reviewer position has now been filled. The supervisory position in that unit, that position became vacant in October of 2020, and it's in recruitment now. So both of those positions should be filled and processing applications here shortly. There will be some time for training of the new staff to get them up to speed, but I would anticipate that we're going to see a reduction in the review times as a result of those positions being filled this spring.
Thank you. I know that the analysts may have it, but if we could get the list of the 14 vacancies, that their names of their positions and just how long they've been vacant, that would be very helpful just for the committee. I'm going to go to page 10, Secretary McCord. A great diagram in reference to every jurisdiction and how they did on the census. And let me first lift up that I'm very thankful for your leadership in reference to the census and the committee count. But you have Baltimore City. I see that Baltimore City faced these challenges in reference to the self-response rate. But I think that if we could also get an outlook of how we compare in reference to other urban jurisdictions, I think that we all know that Baltimore City faces different challenges than the other 23 jurisdictions, and it would be a better outlook to see how we look against Chicago, Cleveland, other urban jurisdictions that face similar challenges to us. That would be very much so helpful.
Mr. Chair, we can do that. We'll get that for you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to your response very quick. I know that you said that one of the positions have been vacant since December 5th of 2018. If you can comment on that, because that is 3 years, Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, the position's vacant since December of 2018 is what you're saying.
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes. Well, it's a process of understanding what we need the replacement to do, looking at what somebody's been doing, have we become more efficient at doing it, and are those duties still needed, and where else could this person be done? So, I mean, it's got age on it, that's for sure. But the person who, let me just say that things are not done the way they were when the person who vacated that position vacated their position. So things have become way more modernized, and we need to figure out how we do things in today's world and going forward, and not simply replace the position that did something, let's just say, the old way. That's the easiest and most polite way to say that, sir.
Got it. Last question, Mr. Secretary. In your response, you acknowledge that you have a seat at the IEC. There's an ongoing issue in reference to the IEC with enrollment and projecting enrollment in the right manner. And I think that as a planner, you have the subject matter expertise, but I haven't heard your voice in reference to some of the schools, some of the challenges that Baltimore City face in reference to how they distinguish enrollment and how they're coming up with it and how the IEC. So if you could just explain your role and how do you engage as the IEC, especially when we meet those challenges, because Secretary McCord, when the young people are in these challenging buildings and we're trying to address this issue, it's only harming our young people when they can't get in the building because we're arguing about the enrollment number. And as a planner, you have a very critical role, and you can have that ability to help the IEC make good decisions, but I just haven't seen it. And I know that you've also taken some votes that I found it a little bit challenging.
Mr. Chairman, let me tell you that I have one person from my staff that is detailed almost exclusively to work with the IAC. And the IAC has come a long way, and we're trying to get better at it. We understand that there are challenges. When we look at enrollments, our school enrollments up to this point, now I don't know how it's this year has put a wrench in lots of things for what the enrollment projections have been, but our enrollment projections by and large have been within just a few 0.0% of what actually happens in the school. So each jurisdictions may be off by a bit. The regulations provide that if you're off by more than 5% from the Department of Planning's projections, then we have to have a discussion to figure out what's going on there. We have those discussions all the time with each jurisdiction, including Baltimore City, about how to get a handle on the enrollments. So we're trying to figure out how to factor in private school enrollment to see how people either defecting or going towards private schools are affecting things. We're trying to make sure that we look at each neighborhood and see how best we can project enrollments. Not everybody does it the same way, Senator. We try to make sure that we're looking at the actual birth rates in each area. Birth rates 5 years from now will tell you a lot about what to expect in the school. A lot of the outlying jurisdictions will look at their building rate and look at assigning a number for the number of children per townhouse, the number of children per single family home, the number of children per apartment and condominium. We try to stick to the vital records and say, we know this many children were born in this zip code at this time. And 5 years from now, we should expect them in first grade. And we go backwards and say, in 4 years, you might expect them in preschool. So we're trying to keep tabs on that information. And by and large, we've been very, very good at doing that. And this year is going to be a challenge. We know this year is a challenge, and we're already trying to figure out what's the best way to refine these numbers. We would like to get to the point on the IEC where we can figure out the child that attends this elementary school is likely to attend this middle school and likely to attend this high school, and try to track them through the system and see what's happening. Once we can track it even better, I've had discussions with the executive director IEC to make this come to fruition. What do we need? So there's actually a pin that will help do that. And that's what I'm trying to do. Get this person to try to get to the point where we can figure out where the child will end up graduating from and work it backwards. And so we can project going forward. So we're working on that, sir.
I appreciate you, Secretary McCord, and I appreciate your efforts. Comment. While we're working on it, and we're working on it for 2, 3, 4 years, it's not me and you that's suffering, it's our young people that's suffering. Senator Edwards, I see you have questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My staff, for some reason, can't find some of this written testimony, so it's hard to keep track. And it's good to see that Mr. Gray talks as fast as he ever did, whether it's in committee or on Zoom. He does a good job with that. My question, Secretary McCord, and you may have said it and I missed it. I apologize if I did. Self-response was great. I'm assuming that self-response was mainly through the computer process, or do you consider mail-ins and everything else self-response?
The definition of self-response for the census would be, for a census, is going to be the internet response, phone response, and the mail-in response. All three count as self-response.
So do you have a preliminary chart of what numbers you have by subdivision at this time, or you have anything together on that you could let us look at?
I think they're still on the website, sir, but I'll make sure I get something to you.
And so how do you know in the end that you've contacted in some manner, either through self-response and or personal? I guess you still send people out sometime, that you've got everybody, that you think you got everybody that lives in a subdivision or a, county, town, whatever. How do you know that?
Well, Senator, that the actual knocking on the doors and getting someone to respond is the federal responsibility. And we will figure that out once they give their number. It's almost 2-year wait for that to figure out how many of those houses didn't have somebody actually living in it. So it's all based on addresses at the moment until they confirm that nobody was living there. So then that'll drop out of the denominator. But there's no one from the state that goes and knocks on the door. It's just the federal people. And one of the I had 24 tablets I ordered to make sure we could get people to respond, but I needed a federal person there with my people at any time, because none of my people take the same oath that the federal government people take to preserve the confidentiality of that information. And I pleaded to have my people deputized, to say, why can't we just have our people take the same oath, suffer the same penalty of 5 years in jail and $250,000 fine if they release any personal information, because we had the ability to do that. The US Census Bureau used my tablets probably on 5 or 6 occasions just to recruit for the census enumerators. So they were used in a way that I didn't anticipate, but it still helped to get enumerators hired. So I took them to the Eastern Shore and stood with federal people to do that. I don't know how much of that was done in every area of the state, but we made them available anytime somebody wanted them. So Senator, I can't say that clearly no person from the state is responsible for knocking on a door, but they will delete those addresses and we'll get better numbers.
I'm not saying your people do a good job. That's really, I just want to know how you get to the end zone. Because there's a lot of people that don't want you checking on them. They don't want the government to know. You know, I live back in the middle of the woods, 20 miles, so don't come back this dirt road and try to find me scenario. But
No.
I don't think I dreamt this, but one time, it's either the last census or the one before in a little town I live in, when the census finally came out, they said, we don't agree with your numbers. This is for the municipality itself. And if my memory's correct, they told them, well, you can go door to door and do your own. And if it's different than ours, and you can verify what you did different, we'll accept yours. Is that still viable?
Sir, I can't honestly say if that's a reconciliation strategy they still accept. I do not know.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to give it to Chairman Corman at this time. You have a number of delegates that have questions.
Thank you, Chair McCray. I apologize to my colleagues in the departments for being late, and let me turn it over to my chair, Chair Macintosh.
Thank you. And actually, I didn't imagine I'd be saying a word during this meeting, but Senator McCray raised an issue that I am very aware of, and that is school construction, IEC, and how we count our students and what happens because of the bureaucratic mess and mire we get ourselves in. I mean, Senator McCray is absolutely right. There are children in Baltimore City right now in his district that have been denied a renovated or new school for going on 4 years now. I mean, and actually, I think their buildings were emergency situations, but oh well. What you said in that answer explains a lot of how we get to this bureaucratic, absolutely halt on school construction. You talk about an app. You want to be able to predict when one kid goes from this elementary school and where they're going to go to middle school and how you want to track all these kids around. I'm here to tell you that in highly urbanized situations as Baltimore City, you can't do that. And the only people who have any idea about where these kids are tracking and going is the school system. They're the only ones. Do you realize that in Baltimore City, we have more homeless kids in our school system than many of the Eastern Shore or Western Maryland school districts in total? Over 7,500 and counting, and it's getting bigger this year. You can't track those kids with an app. You can't predict where they're going to be. You can't predict where they're going to be next month or next week. And so what happens at the IAC when there's a difference between the IAC and the local government as to the projections on enrollment? The project stops. It stops. Or if you're lucky enough to be from a wealthier county or a county that has a lot of reserves, the county says, look, we're going to build a larger square footage building than you're going to approve, and we, the county, will pay for it. And the project moves ahead. But in Baltimore City and poor subdivisions or poor counties around this state, that attitude stops projects in poor counties. That attitude, this, we got a difference, your project can't move on. It stops projects because counties cannot just say, oh, okay, we're going to build it at this square footage, even though you don't agree, we'll pay for it. That doesn't happen in Somerset County. I bet you it wouldn't happen in Garrett County and many other counties around the state. And so we have now, and I would ask to follow up with Senator McCray. We have now our top 4 school construction projects in Baltimore City have once again been slammed door shut over these kinds of bureaucratic, and it really is just, I'm running around when there is no possibility for someone in your department to figure out where our kids are going to be next week. You are dealing with a highly transient population. And I will tell you, the only people that know where these kids are the schools. And they should be believed. Their numbers should be trusted because they actually know more than any of us here do about those children. So it's, isn't that so, Senator McCray?
Yes, it is so, Madam Chair.
Yeah, we're frustrated. We're at a boiling point here, and so we've got 4 schools that we're on hold once again. Didn't get approved, and a lot of the discussion is around, enrollment. Well, I'll tell you who the experts are and who they're not, and so I would ask for you to do what Senator McCray asked you to do, and it's possibly take another look at the way we've been treating poor districts. That's it. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I'll be happy to take a look at that enrollment for you. I will.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Vice Chair Krim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Chair, for bringing that issue forward. And I will support you here because I work closely with a nonprofit for homeless children in Frederick County. And who do they work with? The schools, because the schools know where those homeless children are and what the needs are of the homeless children. So you are absolutely right. So thank you for bringing that up. So Secretary McCord, we've heard about the census data and how important it is for government programs. Do you do anything internally to provide any kind of instruction to the private sector on how they could use census data? Or do you put it out there on your website, or do these businesses know how to get the census data? And then the second question is on redistricting. And could you give us a timeline on how that's going to go? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chair. The Department of Planning sponsors nearly 100 data sets on the open data portal that Maryland provides. And we get calls all the time from business about, do you have any information on this or something else? And we always hook them up with either data we have or data where we know it's available so they can check that. And so the Department of Commerce works with us also, and there are data sets that we use all the time. Businesses, or they call the state data center, we tell them where it's available and tell them where you can find it. So the answer to that in short is yes, we do help businesses anytime we're contacted with that. And then the redistricting timeline, right now, our best information is the census numbers will not be available to July 31st. And that's still a guess. That's still an estimate from the Census Bureau. Once the census, if the census numbers were available July 31st, then it would take about 1 month in Maryland to reallocate the incarcerated individuals to their last known address prior to incarceration. So that wouldn't be until August 31st to have those prisoner reallocations completed. And then that would be the adjusted figures that could be used for redistricting. So that's the kind of basic number first. The Congress was supposed to have numbers delivered by December 31st, and that deadline has not been met. And we keep an eye on the census website all the time to see the latest and greatest as far when we can get those numbers. And July 31st is the last date that we've seen from the Census Bureau about getting numbers out to the states. So as soon as those numbers come out, we are ready to do the reallocation process and ready to have it done hopefully within a month. So then anybody can use those numbers to start redrawing lines. So that's your basic two numbers. We add a month to whenever we get them. Our best estimate of when we're going to get them is July 31st at this point.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Before I turn to my colleague, Delegate Metzger, since it's on this topic, let me just ask a quick question.
Sure.
I understand you are not the Redistricting Commission, but you're hosting the website, you're setting and staffing the meetings, and coordinating the communications among other activities, not you personally, but your department. So I just wanted to ask if all of the meetings of that body would be live streamed over the internet?
That's the idea right now, yes, sir. So the meetings will be open meetings, and we'll make them available to everyone.
Okay, so the Open Meetings Act doesn't require that a meeting be live streamed. So I'm asking if the meetings will be over the internet.
That's what we've been discussing. However, the commission, once it's finally formed, we are preparing for the process of making the meetings live stream.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. Delegate Metzger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I need to thank everybody today for the good spirited discussion. Thank you, Senator McCray. I've enjoyed listening to you because most of your questions were what was addressed. What I wanted to talk about really was the numbers in Baltimore City. Secretary McCord, if you could address that. What is the numbers that you have for Baltimore City? I've been hearing rumors that it's very low and not nearly what they should be. Can you address that some?
Well, we will not be able to address that until I can have my people try to project what we would have expected. And I can't comment on what the numbers that were reported from Baltimore City are. The report from Baltimore City is that the numbers were, the response rate wasn't as good as it was last time. But whether those numbers are I can't say that off the top of my head here.
So let me ask you directly, projected is different from suggested, or suggested is the same as projected? And bring me in.
No, let me just more clearly, projected would be based on numbers that we are relatively sure of, and then you make a projection on what you would expect the following year. So we don't know what we don't know as far as the people that didn't respond, how many people didn't respond. So once the true up gets done at the U.S. Census Bureau, they will provide a number. We will compare that to what we had projected for Baltimore City. So we've got projections for Baltimore City, and we'll see how that compares to what the Census Bureau says they actually enumerated.
Okay, and then the follow-up just is my colleague Delegate Krim asked about the lines, the redistricting. Sounds like that's going to be almost in September, and wouldn't that be kind of a late for the people that are looking to run for another office in the following year?
I've been seeing that report in the newspapers also, sir. But we can't do anything until we have the numbers. So there are some municipalities that are considering whether they conduct an election based on the numbers that we have currently, because their charter may require an election, an off-season election at a time that's different. But we're all across the country just waiting for the numbers to be released by the Census Bureau. And then we're one of 9 states that has to do the reallocation of prisoners. So we have teed that up to be ready to do that as quickly as possible so that there's not an extra delay that's because of what the Maryland law requires. So we are ready to go as soon as we get the numbers to get them reallocated.
Thank you. And my final comment, it's all about the children. We've got to get these, we've got to do the right thing for our kids. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Chair McCray. That's all I see on the House side.
Thank you. And I see no senators with their hands raised. At this time, I'd just like to say thank you, Secretary McCord, for the work that you do on behalf of Marylanders. Look forward to getting the information back that we requested. And I think that it is very important to acknowledge our budget analysts. And Mr. Gray, I just want to say thank you for the work that you did. At this time, if we can bring up our budget analyst, Mr. Caleb Weiss, for the Maryland Insurance Administration.
I'm going to start the screen share now, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
Could I get the screen share ability, please?
Yep, you have it now.
Okay. Oh, there it goes. Thank you. Okay. For the Maryland Insurance Administration, you can see here on the cover page for fiscal 2022 that the budget is projected to decrease by 2.1 million or 5.8%. Moving on to Exhibit 1, this shows the agency spending. As you can see, as in past years, the majority of it, 82%, is personnel, followed by rent at 5%, IT contracts at 3%, and then you have various other expenses. For the where it goes chart, you can see the total decrease of 2.1 million. And you see a small increase in personnel for the annualization of the 2% COLA. And then I'd like to direct your attention down to the bottom here, where you have the bulk of the decrease comes from this one-time fiscal 2021 spending on legacy IT system replacement. This project is ongoing. However, the expenses in fiscal 2022 and onward are much smaller compared to the past years. So that's what you're seeing there. We also have the completion of a federally funded healthcare coverage study. And so that's about $250,000 decrease as well. For the first issue that we identified is the MIA's lease extension on St. Paul Office Tower. You heard about this during last session. This was where there was a dispute as to where MIA was going to have their offices. It was either going to be at the current place, which is St. Paul Tower, where they previously had their offices, or at Montgomery Park. And there were a number of appeals to the Maryland State Board of Contract Appeals. And we were just asking the MIA brief the budget committee on any continuing ramifications for its operations or budget due to this contract dispute. The second issue we identified has to deal with the OLA Office of Legislative Audit's review of the fiscal 2020 budget closeout. And I've highlighted here the two findings. The first is that MIA could not readily explain the deficit in the Healthcare Regulation Fund, which had increased from approximately $250,000 in June of 2017 to $1.4 million in June of 2020. The $1.4 million deficit was improperly offset by surplus funds in the Insurance Regulation Fund. And we're asking the MIA be prepared to brief the Budget Committee on the reasons for this growing deficit and any corrective actions that are being taken. The second funding is that MIA did not transfer the balance of healthcare provider rate stabilization funds, RSF, to the MDH, Maryland Department of Health, as required by law. The audit reports MIA failed to justify the retention of these funds, which was about $8.1 million as of June of this past year, 2020. According to state law, these funds are supposed to be transferred to MDH for the purpose of retaining certain healthcare providers in the state. MIA argued that these funds were necessary to cover any HMO and MCO premium tax refunds that are required to be paid. However, these premium tax refunds typically total between $17,000 and $3 million, respectively. And so this is well below the $8.1 million that was retained. The rate stabilization fund, the RSF, is effectively going to be repealed in July 1 of 2021. And at that point, all premium tax payments will be deposited in the general fund. And we're asking MIA to brief the budget committees on this issue. Related to this issue too, we also have a BRFA action that DLS is recommending, and that is adding a provision to transfer $5 million of improperly retained fund balances from the rate stabilization fund to the general fund. Other than that, however, we have no further recommendations, and we concur with the governor's allowance.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. Is there any questions amongst the committee about the budget analyst report? I don't see any on your side either, Mr. Chair, for the House. So if it's okay with you, I'll just go on to ask Madam Commissioner to come up. Madam Commissioner Kathleen Bahrain for the Maryland Insurance Administration.
Hello, just make sure that my sound is working properly.
Yes, ma'am.
So thank you very, very much. I appreciate that. Okay. So thank you, subcommittee chair and members, for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm Kathleen Bahrain, Maryland's new insurance commissioner. With me today are Paula Keene, the Chief Information Officer for the MIA, Phil Ermer, the Executive Director of our Premium Tax and Company Licensing Unit, and Godwin Aram, who is our Director of Fiscal Services. Also with me today is Jay Kuhn, the Deputy Commissioner, Greg Durwart, our Chief of Staff, Van Dorsey, our Principal Counsel, Michael Patty, the Director of Government Relations, and Spencer Harris, our Assistant Director of Fiscal Services. They are available to you should you have any questions that I'm unable to answer. I'd like to first thank Caleb Weiss of the Department of Legislative Services for his analysis of the Maryland Insurance Administration's fiscal year 2022 budget. I'd also like to thank Bridget Patton of the Department of Budget and Management for her assistance in developing the administration's fiscal year 2022 budget. The Maryland Insurance Administration, as you know, is an independent unit of state government organized in accordance with Title II, Subtitle 1 of the Insurance Article. We are responsible for enforcing the laws governing the business of insurance within the state. The agency promulgates regulations to carry out the insurance article, issues bulletins and other guidance for the insurance industry and from consumers of insurance products in the state. The MIA does not receive any money from the state's general fund. The administration is a specially funded state agency supported entirely through fees and assessments on the insurance industry. As Caleb indicated, we've been asked to address three issues. First, we were asked to address whether there are any continuing ramifications for the MIA's operations or budget in regard to our lease extension with the St. Paul office tower. The MIA does not anticipate any such issues with regard to the lease. The Board of Public Works did approve the 10-year lease under which the MIA is currently operating. It's not anticipated that the procedural issues that were raised with regard to the lease procurement handled by DGS will adversely impact the MIA. The MIA is not a party to the appeal, which is currently being handled by the Office of the Attorney General on behalf of DGS. And our principal counsel is here as well if you have any specific questions about that. But we do not believe that there will be any impact on the MIA if the appeals are successful. The MIA has also been asked to discuss with the committee the reason for the growing deficit in the Healthcare Regulatory Fund and any corrective actions that are being taken. So when I took office on May 18th, 2020, we were in the middle of our audit by the Office of Legislative Auditors. And very shortly after my arrival, I was informed through the auditors that the HCRF was deficient. As soon as I became aware, I initiated an internal investigation to verify the amount of the deficit, the reason for the deficit, and to devise a plan to correct it. What we determined was, there's no good way to say this, but what we determined was that the deficiency in the HCRF had accumulated over several years because the Fiscal Services Unit did not go through an annual process to establish the budget by considering the historic costs and expenses of the Appeals and Grievance Unit and then projecting the needs based on that historic data. Rather, the unit was using the same budget amount year over year to determine and to make the assessment. And when that amount was insufficient, it used the MIA's general operating funds to pay those expenses. And then those advanced expenses were not tracked or incorporated into the next year's assessment. That is what happened. In order to prevent this from happening again, the MIA has adopted and implemented revised procedures, which now require the Fiscal Services Unit to identify the annual costs and expenses incurred by the MIA's Appeals and Grievance Unit, to determine the costs and expense and complaint trends, to estimate future costs and expenses and HCRF needs based on those considerations. Additionally, the procedures require the FSU to consider annually the HCRF fund balance deficit, if there is one, or surplus, if there is one, in its calculation of the HCRF assessment amount. And all of those reviews and internal approval processes will be documented. The MIA is also separately reporting the special fund balances at fiscal year-end closing. We've also implemented, or in the process of implementing, an internal audit protocol, which will include the verification by the MIA's separate examination and auditing unit that these processes are performed and that they are performed accurately. That audit report will come directly to the commissioner to assure full accountability and oversight. In addition to addressing how to prevent this from happening again, we have worked with our council to develop a plan of recoupment that has been shared with the auditors. The MIA will recoup the deficiencies over 5 years. These amounts, as recovered, will be paid to the general fund. This year, the HCRF budget and assessments were determined based on the new procedures that I've described and are included, the first year's recoupment was included in those amounts. With respect to the next issue, you have asked us to discuss with the committee the current balance that was withheld in the Rate Stabilization Fund and provide an explanation as to why the MIA believes that these funds had to be retained. Caleb has accurately addressed what the reasoning of the MIA has been historically. The Rate Stabilization Fund is funded specifically by premium taxes that are paid by certain HMOs and by MCOs. And there's a disconnect in timing. Premium tax is assessed on a calendar year basis. Carriers pay an estimated tax during the calendar year. They submit an annual return, which is essentially a true up on March 15th. The fiscal year closes on June 30th. And not all of the tax refunds have been calculated, audited, verified by that date. Part of that is a timing issue because MCOs, of course, are regulated by Medicaid. Medicaid does do annual premium adjustments. Oftentimes, they are not completed by the June 30th date. However, so the MIA's practice has been to withhold an amount in order to fund the premium refunds that will occur after June 30th. In my conversations with the auditors, that approach conceptually was not a primary concern. The primary concern was, as Caleb previewed, the amount that was being retained and the ability to tie that to what the real refunds had been over time. And so in our discussions, with the auditors, as we went through and evaluated and talked about revising these procedures, was to assure that if funds were going to be retained, that there was a very careful analysis and documentation of appropriate amounts based on historic trends. Now, to some extent, this conversation is moot because the fund sunsets in 2021. And so our exercise this year will really be to assure that as the fund sunsets, we retain enough so that all refunds can be paid, because there will be no new premium dollars coming in to the fund from those particular entities that would allow us to make refunds. So we have developed a new process, a new procedure, a new mechanism for estimating those amounts and documenting those estimates, so they are very, very close to what is actually needed as we wind down the Rate Stabilization Fund. And in developing these processes and procedures, we have tried to work very transparently and very cooperatively with the auditors to make sure that they agree that the way in which we're approaching it is an appropriate way. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. Is there any questions for Madam Commissioner or our team? Mr. Chair, I see no hands raised at this moment from the household. So,
Sorry, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair.
Oh, sorry.
Madam Vice Chair.
Thank you. I was a little late, Chairman McCray, getting my hand up. So Commissioner, thank you for being here, and I appreciate your attention to all those audit issues. I chair the audit committee on the House side, and our auditors are always very happy to work with the agency to resolve audit findings. So thank you very much. I do want to ask you about your office requirements since we've been teleworking. So how is that working within your agency? Are you reducing the amount of floor lease space that you need? Could you just comment on that, please?
So our lease is obviously through DGS, which actually has developed the release. We have gone through an exercise with all other agencies of identifying where we could consolidate space. Our agency is, at least at the moment, over 90% of our employees are 100% telework. And we have looked at, once the pandemic is over, how might we, what would our office space needs really be? And then we've provided that information to DGS so that they can consider that, how we might, maybe have another agency move in with us, or how we can consolidate our space. Honestly, I think that what we've learned through telework is that many of our employees work extremely well, very efficiently. The flex time works extremely well. And so I think we will be rethinking, what work looks like, even after people are able to safely return to the work environment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Seeing no further questions, Madam Commissioner, just wanted to say thank you for your service. And we also wanted to make sure, I don't see him on my screen, make sure we thank Caleb Weiss, our budget analyst, for the great work that you do. At this time, I would like to call up Mr. Steve McCullough, the budget analyst for MDOT.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gray, Chairman Corman, you should be able to see the document now. I'm Steve McCullough, Department of Legislative Services. I'm here today to present the overview analysis for the Maryland Department of Transportation. This is the story of the MDOT budget this year. It really is very much one impacted by COVID. This exhibit shows the transportation services. It's a year-over-year comparison from a weekly basis. As you can see, in the early part of the pandemic, all types of transport services and uses were down substantially. In more recent times, transit and airport traffic has fluctuated around 60%, and traffic use of toll facilities have fluctuated around the 20% mark. That has impacted the budget, obviously, for the trust fund. And Exhibit 2 shows a comparison of the 5 years that overlap between the January 2020 forecast and the January 2021 forecast. And as you can see from this exhibit, revenues are down by 1.5, almost $1.6 billion between the two forecasts over this 5-year period, expanding from fiscal 2021 through 2025. And that reduction would have been greater except for the use of federal CARES Acts that are anticipated to be used in the current forecast. This is a good place to note that neither forecast, and it wouldn't have been in last year's, but the current forecast does not yet include any stimulus funding from the December federal stimulus. So that will increase the balance on the revenue side a little bit better. But on the expenditure side, you can see how that is translated through, with operating budget over this 5-year period down just over $735 million. Capital program over this 5-year period down over close to $650 million. Exhibit 3 shows the fiscal 2020 closeout of the trust fund, and the key point here, and the reason I point this out, is the department did use $336 million of CARES Act funding in order to close out fiscal 2020. Even though the pandemic only affected a little more than the last quarter of the year, it did quickly impact revenues, and the required spending decreases would have been much greater had those federal funds not been available. Exhibit 4 shows the now looks at the full 6-year forecast of the trust fund and shows the state source revenues and the federal relief funds. And you can see that motor fuel, titling, and federal capital aid, are the 3 largest funding sources for the trust fund in this current year 6-year forecast. Looking at Exhibit 5, this is the detailed forecast, and it's mostly in this analysis as a point to reference back to should you have questions or want to look at a specific year. I will point out, however, a couple kind of key areas. The first one is the bond proceeds line, and you can see that, up till the actual 2020, we were relying pretty significantly on debt to help support the capital program. But when the pandemic hit, that is drastically being reduced. There are a couple reasons. Even leading up prior to the pandemic, MDOT was approaching its minimum debt service coverage levels, and that's shown on this line. They have a administrative goal to not go down below 2.5, and that is a ratio between the prior year's net income versus future maximum debt service. They do have in their bond covenants a requirement that if they ever breach the 2.0 level, they have indicated they will not issue any further debt until these levels increase above the 2.0 line. So with less debt, less revenue, you can see in the capital line, and we'll be talking about this as we go, this is the big decline in the state funding of capital as we go forward. This is a graphic depiction basically of that capital. I note a couple things here. In this top line of other state funds, you've probably heard the announcements in the fiscal briefing and the governor's highlights book. The administration is planning to utilize $125 million in general obligation bond premium funds for support of the MDOT capital program, specifically for the WMATA capital needs. That $125 million in 22 is contingent on passage of a section in the capital budget bill authorizing the use of those funds for that. General funds, which have been in the forecast and in the budget for the last few years, are not in the budget for fiscal 2022, but you see that in 2023, they start ramping up at 42 million, and for 24 through 6, they're back at the 167 million level that they've been anticipated in prior forecasts. This Exhibit 7 shows the 6-year capital program, and it compares the January 2020 capital plan versus the January 2021 capital plan. You can see that in all funds, the funding decrease to the capital program is almost $1.2 billion. And but if you notice on the funding line down here, the state source funds for the capital program are down by $1.3 billion over this 6-year period. And if you look down at the capital, the special funds only, which again are the state sourced portion of the capital funding, the total 1.3 is distributed. You see that there are large decreases in special funds for the state highway. Transit administration is appearing to receive a little bit more support. Those are mostly, the increases are mostly in the out years of the 6-year forecast, but there have been many people who have been advocating for increased capital spending for transit. This is just a graphic of the capital program. You can see that after the revenue increase that occurred in 2013, the gas tax increase, capital spending increased. This was supported a lot with bond funds leveraging. We now see that going forward with pandemic and the reduced bonding capacity, that the next few years, the total capital spending is expected to be down. And even in the out years, it's much lower than the peak levels of the last few years. Exhibit 9 shows the uses of the fiscal 2022. So we're transitioning from looking at 6-year numbers to just the fiscal 2022 numbers. And you can see that in fiscal 2022, $5.0 billion in the trust fund, 39% goes for capital, 45% for operating, see debt service, and then aid grants as well. This table shows the detail from that previous chart, and again is there for people to refer back to, but this shows the operating budget at the top by mode, capital in the middle, and the debt service and the state aid lines with the total funding at the bottom. This pie chart shows the allocation of the 2022 operating budget by mode. And as you can see, transit and especially combined transit with the MTA and WMATA account for about 61% of the operating spending in 2022. Transit is a very operation intensive operation with the people providing the service as well. Exhibit 12 shows the regular contractual positions. There are no overall positions on the departmental level. There are some changes between administrations, and the number of contractual FTEs in the allowance does decrease by 7.2 FTEs. Exhibit 13 shows the highway user capital grant levels. The capital grant levels are currently based on 13.5% share of the revenues going into the an amount equivalent to 13.5% of the revenues in the gasoline motor vehicle revenue account. You see that in fiscal 2022, total funding is $254.2 million, an increase of $17.4 million over the current year. I will say that the current year was written down from what the allowance was last year based on the revenue expectations due to the pandemic. This pie chart shows the capital funding for fiscal 2022 only by mode. And you can see that State Highway has the largest chunk at 32%. I will note that in prior years, the State Highway amount was closer to 40% of total capital, with transit between MTA and WMATA somewhere between 25 and 34%. The reason this decreases so much is really the decreases in revenue and the allocation of funding due to the COVID reduction to the capital program. Exhibit 15 shows other funds. There are about $574 million in other funds as part of the CTP, or Consolidated Transportation Program. These are funds that do not flow typically through the state's budget. However, on the next page, I will point out that here's the two lines for WMATA capital use of the GO bond premiums. If that's approved, these funds themselves will just be a revenue to the trust fund and then be appropriated. So that is a change in terms of the normal way that other funds are depicted. Turning now to the issues. The first issue is a discussion of the Purple Line and the Purple Line settlement that was just reached last year at the end of the year. As you may recall, there have been disputes between the constructors of the Purple Line in terms of the amount being requested for cost overruns and time delays. That ended up in litigation last fall and was resolved between the parties. And the settlement agreement essentially, MDOT and MTA will be paying a total of $250 million through the Purple Line Transit Partners to the Fluor Enterprises as the member of the constructors entity of the P3. Fluor and its affiliates are exiting the agreement completely, and the Purple Line Transit Partners will now are in the process of trying to bring another design build contractor on board to complete the construction of the project. That process is expected to be complete hopefully by September of this year. In the meantime, MTA is managing the project and is spending some funds in furthering that construction of the project. They are focusing on activities that will reduce the risk of overruns in the future to the project. These includes finishing design, procuring the final permits, and doing utility relocation work. All of those activities will help in the procurement, finding a new contractor to hopefully get a very competitive bid on that market to bring them on board. And Exhibit 16 shows that schedule, and as I had indicated, they hope to be at financial close by mid-September of this year. The second issue is the discussion of the I-495, I-270 P3 program. In mid-December, MDOT initiated a procurement to bring on board the phase developer for the first phase of the project, which would construct the improvements from just south of the of the American Legion Bridge to the I-270 spurs, and then up to I-270 to I-370. MDOT has also recently announced the selection of the preferred alternative as part of the environmental review process, or NEPA. They selected option 9, which would entail having 2 managed toll lanes on each side of I-495 along the alignment I mentioned and up I-270. On 270, however, it involves the conversion of the current high occupancy vehicle lanes to a toll lane. So there will be new construction for 1 lane on I-270 in each direction as well. This procurement is ongoing in tandem with the ongoing activities of the environmental review, or NEPA review process. The preferred alternative of those toll lanes will need to be approved by the Federal Highway Administration as they accept the NEPA process, the environmental impact statement, and issue a record of decision. Should a record of decision for that process not be forthcoming, this phased developer contract that is being solicited now will just basically end. I do believe there are some payments that would accrue to the winning team if that were to occur. We've asked MDOT to brief the committees on the current changes, and also to talk about how the current changes in traffic behavior due to the pandemic with increased telework might impact the environmental review and frankly the need for the project at this point. So you'll hear from them on that. Issue 3 is an update on the Transportation Climate Initiative process. You may recall from last year's discussion, the Transportation Climate Initiative, or TCI, it was a regional collaboration of Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and the District of Columbia, looking to reduce the impact of the transportation sector on greenhouse gas emissions, which has been found to be the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in this region. Last year at this point, a draft Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, was released for review and comment. And that MOU anticipated the organizations joining together to create basically a marketplace where fuel distributors would be required to purchase allowances, pollution allowances, for each ton of pollution that would be emitted through the combustion of their fuels. And the proceeds of those auctions would go to the participating member jurisdictions to invest in cleaner technology and to assist disadvantaged communities that were impacted by transportation infrastructure. In December of last year, 2020, District of Columbia joined with Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island to actually sign this MOU and work towards establishing that program that I just described. MDOT and the remaining states have not yet signed on to that. We've asked MDOT to brief the committees on that effort and what their plans are going forward. Issue number 4 is a discussion of some new debt authority that the department is seeking. MDOT has submitted departmental legislation, Senate Bill 259, seeking to receive authorization to have up to $750 million of GARVI debt, which are grant anticipation revenue vehicles, outstanding at the end of any fiscal year. So a GARVI bond would be issued and the repayment of that would be paid from future federal aid. And so these could be used for either highway or transit projects. And depending on which project, if they were all in one, then the federal aid for that mode would be used. It could be a mix of projects that would be funded, and then federal aid from both streams would be committed to the repayment of that. The second piece of new kind of debt, and this was discussed last year in terms of MDOT's plan to begin issuing revenue-backed debt under authority they received in 2014 through the passage of legislation. Last year, they had announced that they were planning and issuing debt for the baggage handling system at BWI and the connector. That had been put on hold for now due to the pandemic and the decline in revenues and the decline in airport passenger traffic. But that is still planned for the future. But what MDOT is currently got planned is a refunding of 3 issues that were issued on behalf of MDOT back in 2012. There were 2 issued by the two issued by the Transportation Authority and 1 by the Economic Development Corporation, or MEDCO. There will be a little bit of debt service savings from this refunding, but more importantly, it begins MDOT's efforts in using this revenue-backed debt at the airport or the Aviation Authority to basically take all of these individual streams that are pledged for particular bonds outstanding, and in the future, all of that project revenue will just be pooled in MAA for MAA revenue-backed debt. It'll be much easier on an accounting basis to manage going forward. So we've just bring that to your attention. Again, it's not new in terms of last year they were planning the use of this, but the refunding plan is new this year. And the final issue that I bring to your attention is the WMATA capital grant, just to make you aware that of the $344 million appropriation in the bill, $125 million of it is contingent on the passage of the legislation authorizing the use of the GEO bond premium funding for this purpose. As I indicated earlier, if that passes, the bond premium funds would just be deposited in the trust fund. This the mandate would be satisfied, and the full 344 would go forward. On the second part of this, just remind the committee that when you all passed the Metro Transit Funding Act in 2018, there were provisions that would provide for the base capital grant to WMATA to be a mandated appropriation if WMATA provided certain audit and other data to MDOT, and then MDOT would need to certify to the governor in writing prior to the beginning of the fiscal year that the information had been received. That would trigger the mandate. MDOT did not make that certification until a few days after the beginning of the fiscal year. So the fiscal 2022 base capital amount is not mandated, which is why this contingent appropriation is possible, since a contingent appropriation cannot satisfy a mandate. But what it does mean is if the General Assembly decides not to authorize the use of these bond premiums, MDOT is going to have to rearrange their capital funding and decide whether they'll find another way of providing this $125 million for WMATA capital, or whether WMATA will see that amount reduced in the 2022 budget. The recommended actions there are two that are annual budget bill language. This first piece of budget bill language requires a notification for a change in the capital program. The second bit of recommended annual language is establishing a position cap for the department. And that concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Corman.
Thank you, Mr. McCullough. I see a hand from outside, Chairman Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Delegate Kittleman.
Thank you. And your last comment is exactly what I wanted to ask about first. Back in 2004, 5, 6, 7, the Department of Transportation had 9,090 something people working for it, PINs. Today, they have exactly the same number of employees. Meanwhile, the budget has gotten quite a degree larger. And I wondered, when you're analyzing this, how is it that MDOT can accomplish so much more with no more people? I guess the answer has to do with outside contracting. And if I'm right, then how do we compare? I would like to be able to compare how much of the work that MDOT is doing, whether it's operating capital, is because we have contracted outside with someone, the kinds of things we used to do in-house. Does that make any sense?
Yes, I mean, to a certain extent, when you look at what MDOT does in the various modes, let's take the State Highway Administration, for example, they are basically running a big capital program and maintaining roads. So on the capital side, they've never directly built those facilities, right? Those have always been contracted. So on the operating side, there's a mix of contractors versus state employees that are out on the roads, on the highways during the snowstorms, plowing the roads. So that is you were correct. Part of the answer, if things if there's more work being done and the same number of people, things are either getting more efficient or you're contracting more out. On the flip side of that, they are experiencing in some of those areas with technology that, everybody has, that in terms of the fiscal side of things and the accounting and all of that, I'm sure that they're utilizing fewer people now than they did 20 years ago because technology has allowed that to occur and people to be more productive. So we can certainly see if we can get you some data in terms of the split between what's being performed by state employees versus contractors. We'll work together.
I would appreciate that. I don't have any problem with it. I just I very much would like to see it. And had not thought about technology, and it really has made a difference. The only other question I have, I'm not sure whether it's for you or for MDOT, but there is a bill in our committee to put aside a bunch of money to provide maintenance for MTA. MTA is dreadful when you look at all the statistics nationwide in its maintenance, and it's not keeping things up. And obviously, WMATA went through the same kind of thing. And my question is, why are we starting new projects to build more transit facilities when we can't even take care of the ones that we have? And again, I don't know if that's a question for DLS, but you all have a lot of good information and opinion, so I thought I would ask.
Well, I think that is a good question. It is really, a policy decision on both the administration and the legislative side. So I will let the department, answer that one. And if we need more information, we'll come back to you as well.
Thank you.
I think Chair McCrae's silence as he's letting me ask my questions. I'll stay on brand with some transit questions. First of all, on Delegate Kittleman's point, my read, Steve, of the CTP, both from last year and then the draft and now the final for this year, is that on their own, the department is increasing MTA capital at least in 23, 24, and 25 beyond what they had proposed last year. Does that sound right?
Yes. I mean, the most of the increases are in those out years.
Okay, but so even though they expressed huge concern last year about increases to MTA, they actually went ahead on their own and did some sizable increases in FY 23, 24, and 25 in the out years.
Yes.
Great, thank you. And then on the WMATA piece, you're not quite a mandate heading. Totally appreciate that, we want them to comply with the sort of legal provisions. Trust me, I particularly want them to apply with them, having helped to draft them. But I just, to their credit, if we accept the premium approach, they will have put in more in total than the mandate would require if we sort of remove the sort of legal niceties of the fund sources and the contingency and all that, right?
Yes, absolutely. And the funding that would be required under the mandate was pegged to the fiscal 2019 level as enacted. I'm just speculating. I believe that there might have been an anticipation that mandate would be triggered quickly, so that in 2018 it was passed, and they maybe thought that by 2020, you only had 1 year. But that has not occurred. Obviously, the capital needs have continued to grow. MDOT has kept pace with it without the mandate. That is, I think, something for the committees to consider going forward, that if you do have legislation that in this area, you might want to either clarify what that mandate should be or how it should be triggered, or remove it if, as you say, MDOT is providing more without the mandate. If you're comfortable going forward, that they will continue to fund what is needed under the constraints, fiscal constraints. It may not be needed. It certainly has not been effective because it hasn't taken effect yet.
So despite telling me at every hearing for 6 years that if we put more to transit, it's going to destroy the transportation program, they've put more to transit and we still have a transportation program? You don't have to answer that, Steve. I'll recognize Vice Chair Krim, if it's all right with Chair McCrae. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question on the Garvey bonds. Did you say that they will be asking the legislature for permission this time? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, if Senate Bill 259 comes across, you will have, whichever committee takes it, will have the opportunity to opine on it.
Okay.
But absent legislation, they are not allowed to issue Garvey debt. Garvey bond debt has to be authorized in some form or fashion. It could be either on a project specific basis, as was done for the ICC, or as submitted by the department. They would like kind of ongoing authority saying, here, we'd like $750 million cap, and they will manage within that. They may use it, they may not, but if they do, they are limited in any year at the end of the fiscal year to 750 outstanding.
So we could prescribe how that bond funding would be used in the legislation.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, seeing no further questions from any of the committee, I'm going to now ask that our Secretary Slater of MDOT come and give the agency report.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Chairman McCrae, Chairman Corman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Greg Slater, Secretary, Maryland Department of Transportation. With me today, I have Jacqueline Hartman, our Chief Financial Officer. I have Heather Murphy, our Director of Capital Planning and Program. And I also have Administrator Kevin Quinn from MTA, as one of the DLS questions was associated with the Purple Line, and I wanted to make sure we could get all of your questions answered. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to discuss the department budget. Before I touch on our financial position and our DLS analysis, I just want to take a moment briefly to mention our employees. Despite the uncertainty in the world today, the men and women of MDOT have continued to serve us as a state through this pandemic. Although I like to think that our employees are superheroes, the MDOT family has been impacted greatly by this pandemic, and we have lost some of our family in this pandemic. And on top of COVID, over the last few months, we've also suffered the tragic loss of 2 of our transit operators killed on the job, serving our citizens. It is critical that we protect our transit operators providing essential transportation services. I want to take a moment and thank Senator McCray for co-sponsoring Senate Bill 91, which would make assaults on transit operators a felony offense, the same as assaults on law enforcement, firefighters, emergency responders, and parole and probation agents. All of our men and women at MDOT continue to work alongside our first responders and work alongside our roadways, and have suffered far too many injuries and deaths because of distracted drivers and just bad behavior. I am grateful for their dedication of all of the MDOT employees and contractors. These transportation employees continue to show resilience and an ability to adapt, and it gives me confidence about the future that makes me proud to work alongside these men and women. COVID has been a little bit of a roller coaster for us, both in the transportation services as well as our revenue. Resilience and ability to adapt have been key over last year. 2020 was frankly one of the most challenging years of my career, and one of the most challenging we have faced as a department. COVID has been a major disruptor in many ways. This virus has changed the way that we do business, but it also challenges us to think about things differently. You know, we were able to accelerate some work on things like the Bay Bridge and cashless tolling, and make great progress on kind of planning for others. We're able to serve more customers with Customer Connect. We're doing public meetings and outreach to our citizens, getting input, and we continue to adapt. But despite the positive impacts, then COVID has really been, that's really kind of the only good news for COVID. You know, we have had significant impacts on our services and revenues. At our lowest point, BWI Marshall Airport, our passenger traffic was down 95%, and our transit ridership was down nearly 80%. Traffic volumes were down around 60. Since then, we've improved. Our traffic volumes have returned to the strongest they've been for a while, currently down about 13%. Our airport passenger traffic is rebounding at a slower rate at about 65%, and our transit has struggled the most with the recovery in ridership, still about half of where they were a year ago. And those declines have certainly impacted our revenues. As mentioned on our DLS analysis, today we have a capital program that our final 6-year program has been we have been able to restore some of our important projects and provided some rebalancing of our capital program, but it is still $1.2 billion less than our program from 1 year ago. I'm cautiously optimistic about the changes we are seeing, but recognize we still have a long way to go to return to those pre-pandemic levels. We've seen some minor improvement in our revenue forecast over the last couple of years. Our revenues are up about $269 million from the draft. But overall, the revenues remain down significantly from where they were a year ago, down about $828 million from last year's CTP. One of the bright spots of our TTF has been our share of the corporate income tax and the sales tax on our rental vehicles, which is up from the draft CTP, up $330 million. Most of our revenues remain largely unchanged from the draft CTP. Operating revenues at MTA and MAA have been the hardest hit, and our revenues are decreased further downward by about $167 million to reflect the early indicators. So a little bit of a slower recovery. So while the improvement shows some promise, our ability to maximize has been our key. We restored the BWI Marshall AB connector baggage handling system replacement, utilizing about $425 million in airport revenue bonds. The bond issuance has been delayed due to a disruption in the bond market associated with the declines in air travel, but we're now on track for the spring and summer. We've been able to add about $400 million in federal funds for the capital program. Most of that is MTA and SHA, though we've used programs like toll credits to allow us to leverage our federal funds in a much better way. We received approximately $500 million in the first round of the CARES funds, using money from FY20 and 21. Our budget does not yet include, as mentioned through the DLS analysis, the second round of CARES Act funding. But as we start to get those allocations and guidance from USDOT, they will go exactly as they were intended in that bill. When building this 6-year program, we focused our priorities on system preservation and safety. We have heard your requests for more transit. When I started this job a year ago, I heard those concerns and heard those requests. We have about, so despite the revenue declines associated with COVID-19, we've been able to rebalance the budget and increase some of that transit funding. Nearly $600 million was added to MTA's capital program from the draft CTP. The Maryland Transit Administration is before you today as the only MDOT business unit receiving more funds in today's CTP than the version from a year ago. Declines were in every one. The diversification of our trust fund is our greatest strength. And that is one that has prevented us from dealing with some of the devastating actions that we've seen in some other states with layoffs and shutting construction projects down halfway, really drastic service cuts in transit. But rebuilding this budget for stability, our focus is it has to be done in a fiscally responsible way that fits within the available funding and allows for that balanced investment as we continue to recover. Turning directly to the DLS analysis, starting with my sincere expression of gratitude for Mr. McCullough for his always thoughtful analysis. He does a tremendous job and has worked with us for many years. The first issue we were asked to respond to was regarding the purple line. Mr. McCullough provided a pretty good summary of the current status of the project. PLTP has issued an RFQ, a request for qualifications for interested firms. We've received a lot of interest. We have several teams that seem to be forming, as well as some questions about work done to date and how that works in. Based on those questions and some requests for additional time, MDOT and PLTP jointly agreed to delay that submission by about 2 weeks, but that will not impact our overall schedule. We believe that was the best course of action to continue to maximize competition and will not impose any significant delays. MTA has continued to work on certain aspects of the project, including final design, utility relocations, civil construction at Glen Ridge Operations and Maintenance Facility, and progressing some of the permits that have been issued under the Maryland Department of Environment. As of February 1st, 2021, the project has secured 57 of those final approvals with 2 conditional approvals, and only 7 remaining MDE packages are out there. So 6 are currently under review for approval, and we anticipate that approval. That will greatly help us in the rebid of this project. These are all critical elements of de-risking with utilities and permits to get some value in the rebid. The second issue we're asked to respond to was regarding the 495-270 project and the travel impacts from COVID-19. Across the region, we're seeing travel impacts similar to the MDOT ones that we've mentioned. Generally, people are returning to their travel more quickly than they are to other forms of travel, to their vehicles quicker than the other forms of travel. The industry is expecting this to be a little bit of a longer term trend, as choice riders for transit may choose a personal vehicle until there's widespread vaccination in the short term. But we also recognize that the increase of teleworking will be a much longer term trend, as some companies have already announced that they do not plan to ever return to 100% of employees being in the office 5 days a week. That will have impacts not only on our roadways, but on office space rentals and restaurants that we cater to as well. The other longer term trend we expect to continue is the growth of e-commerce and home delivery of goods and services. Throughout the pandemic, the Port of Baltimore has had most minimal impacts on its services. As of November, our container cargo volumes were actually up 10% from a year ago. All those deliveries take place on our roadways and more on our rail once we're able to get that Howard Street tunnel in place. We also recognize that the 270 project is not just a project to serve today's traffic, but looking into the future needs and travel needs for several decades. But we do expect that traffic to rebound. The congestion will return at some point with that project. Just to confirm, as Mr. McCullough noted, we are running several processes concurrently. In terms of the traffic, we are running a number of sensitivity analysis or what if scenarios to consider the potential impacts of increased telework, increased levels of e-commerce, decreased discretionary activity, reduced demand when compared to the 2045 regional model. These sensitivity analyses are key to a component of the ongoing environmental analysis. I do want to say finally on that topic that I certainly recognize there continues to be a lot of questions around many aspects of this program. Understanding that our focus is squarely around the American Legion Bridge and that south side of 270 right now. We are committed to transit components, bike and pedestrian components, workforce and labor components, completely working collaboratively to minimize impacts and doing a lot more analysis and local coordination before anything beyond that advances. In fact, the NEPA document now we're working through now includes a phased permitting approach that includes a commitment to not pursue any permits or authorizations or acquisition of right-of-way adjacent to the interstate outside of that phase 1 American Legion Bridge and 270 until further technical environmental review is completed and we're able to build some consensus with our local partners. So our focus right now is squarely around American Legion Bridge and the south side of 270. The third issue we were asked to respond to was regarding TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, and Maryland's decision not to join the CAP and Invest program at this time. MDOT has been coordinating with the Department of the Environment, other state agencies, local governments, and the public on this greenhouse gas and mitigation since 2007, when the Commission on Climate Change first began. When the MOU for the CAP and Invest program was released, there were still many questions on how the program will be structured, including what the emission cap scenarios will be with various policy and investment strategies, public health benefits, revenue generation, and cost to consumers. That uncertainty and the pandemic led to most of the 13 participating jurisdictions, including Maryland, declining to sign at this time, but stay at the table for the development of the model rule as we recover from this pandemic. MDOT and the Department of the Environment have been and will remain actively engaged with TCI to work with our regional partners for that lasting clean transportation and climate progress while continuing our immediate focus on responding to this COVID-19 emergency. The fourth issue was focused on the DLS analysis in regard to MDOT's expanded debt options, including the use of airport revenue bonds to fund the construction of the Concourse AB connector and the baggage handling system. That project, as part of our departmental legislation, Senate Bill 259 allows issuance of additional Garvey bonds. While we were not really asked to kind of talk about the Garvey bonds specifically, I do want to note that the ability to issue additional Garvey bonds is an important tool for us in our tool belt. Garvey bonds can be used for both transit and highway projects and have been used across 25 states across the country for more than $25 billion worth of transit and highway projects. And the final issue we were asked to respond to in regard to the department's required certification to the governor on all requirements of the WMATA laid out in the Metro Transit Funding Act of 2018 have been met. We were working on this issue right up to the deadline, and unfortunately we're unable to provide that certification until July 6th, which is really 3 working days after the June 30th deadline. Despite that, our commitment to WMATA, nearly $800 million, is fully funded in FY22, and we continue to work with WMATA and the other funding jurisdictions to deal with some of the funding challenges that they are seeing as well. The DLS analysis also included 2 recommended actions for the department. Both are pieces of our annual budget language, and the department certainly concurs with those. With that, myself and our team are happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Just trying to unmute myself. Senator Sailing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary, for the information. I want to say kudos to the Harbor Tunnel and how the vast improvements and how we were able to go through the tunnel now in hurry up fashion. And I appreciate that. We look forward to seeing more things like this ahead of schedule. So I appreciate that. But this is my question. We see the work that's been done over at the Key Bridge and what can to continue the ongoing work there. But my problem is that we do have, when we had a conversation about where we're going to put locations for the where we sense and we get the money, I guess you could say the sensors there on the side of the bridge. And we were told they were going to be on the opposite side where they're on the Baltimore County side. And we did have a conversation about that, especially was we talked about the port and Trade Point and the issues there about the truck and the transporting from one place to another. So are we going to still address that? Can we talk about that? Because we know that's been an issue for a long time. Those trucks aren't going over the bridge. They haven't been going over the bridge, and they continue to pay tolls. So can we have a conversation about that still, please? Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm happy to have that conversation, Senator. That's not a topic that I've really kind of worked on in the last several months. So I'm happy to kind of connect with Will Pines, our new Chief Operating Officer over at MDTA, as well as Executive Director of Ports, and have a conversation and have a better understanding of that, continue to work together on that.
That would be great. I've talked to the people at Trade Point Atlantic, and Aaron and I have talked to, haven't talked in a while. I think my delegate has talked to the people at the port, and we want to work with them, but work with you and make sure we come to a common place and we can get this done. So I want to thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chairman Corman, I'm gonna swing it your way because you have more questions from the House of Delegates.
Thank you. Vice Chair Crum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I want to talk to you a little. Hello, Secretary. How are you?
I'm doing well, ma'am. How are you?
It's so good to see you. So I want to talk to you a little bit about system preservation today and how you calculate that in the department. So you answer that question first, please.
Sure. The answer to that question is going to depend on whether you're talking about a berth at the port versus a highway or a bridge versus a rail line, or when it comes to MTA, a big part of that is our transit vehicles, our light rail vehicles, our buses, those types of things. So each of them have kind of performance components to them. And so what you do is system preservation, I'll call asset management. So asset management is a field where you look at the data and the condition, how it's regressing, understanding the life cycle of that asset, and then knowing at what point in the asset that you can make a small investment to extend the life of that asset and to not have to make that larger capital investment. I'm going to go back, historically, 15, 20 years ago, when we were developing a resurfacing program, for instance, we were able to show that every 8 to 9 years, if you do that really quick kind of mill and overlay on the roadway system, over the course of doing that 3 or 4 times, you extend the life cycle of that asset by, 10, 15 years, and you get more for your dollar on that way. Same thing on the bridge side. So, you look at bridges, for instance, what we do is when you look at your annual ratings on bridges, some of the elements may be 5s and 6s and 7s on that scale. But what you do is you look at those middle range numbers and you say, okay, what bridges do I have that are structurally deficient, that are rated, below that 5, that I need to replace a deck or a pier? Or you look at those ones that are 6s where I can do something like make a small investment and turn that 6 into an 8. Because you get about 10 years per number on a bridge when it comes to traffic and those types of things. So, a great example of that, ma'am, is our bridge painting program. So we can make a minimal investment, really sandblast the steel girders on our bridges, repaint them, and add years to the life of a bridge. Same thing on the rail side. So, you look at the performance of that rail infrastructure, the condition of the ground around it, the different components, you give them performance specifications, and then you do a regression analysis to understand. No matter what the asset is, what I'll tell you is you either pay now or you pay more later. It's just like the roof on your house. And so, you can replace the shingles and get 20 more years out of your roof, or you let it go to the point where the roof starts to fail and it's a much more substantial investment. So the goal really is for all system preservation, is to let that data guide you and make that smaller investment 2 or 3 times before you have to make the larger, bigger capital investment of completely replacing a rail line or a bridge. The vehicles are a little bit different. They all have certain life cycles, whether it's a light rail vehicle or a metro vehicle, or even a bus. And so what we're trying to do now, I'll use our buses for an example. They have a certain life cycle, but we're in this transition period where we're moving our fleet of buses to more zero emission buses. So, what we have is a contractual mechanism that's out there today where we can purchase both electric buses as well as some of our clean diesel buses. And so, most of our new purchases, almost all of our new purchases are going to be more on the electric bus component. But what we're trying to do is invest in the infrastructure as well for the charging and those types of pieces over the years. But so the answer to your question is going to be different depending on the asset, but every asset has a certain life cycle and every asset has a performance spec that you like to use as a guide when you're making those smaller investments to get greater life out of it.
So when you put together your budget every year, do you figure out what's going to be in your system preservation budget? Do you do that on a yearly basis?
Yes. Some of the asset classes are more mature than others in terms of their data and the data that we collect and, frankly, risk. So for instance, the risk of an issue on a rail line or a bridge is very different than the issue of a sign falling down, for instance. So you have to look at that. One of the more complex issues of trying to put a system preservation budget together is looking across those assets. So if you look at the performance between them and trying to balance them, you want to make sure you don't overinvest so that another asset will fail when you can really meet your performance spec. So so we're doing that now. We had a very mature program on the highway side and not as mature program in either at the port or over at MTA. So, we're expanding our asset management program. One of the goals that I laid out when I came into this job a year ago is to build more of that data-driven asset management across the department, so we can not only make trade-off decisions from roadways to bridges to signs, but we can make those from berths at the Port of Baltimore, runways at the airport, as well as our rail lines and our bus lines, and be able to make those systematic decisions better as a department as the better data collection matures.
So historically, we have done very good with system preservation for our roads, but you're saying we haven't done such a good job traditionally with our transit, correct?
Yes, and in fact, that's not uncommon. In fact, the roadway, the highway asset management industry is really a little bit more mature than some of the transit pieces. The transit industry really started to mature when some of the new federal regulations came out with after safety lieu that included MAP 21, included a lot of performance measures and asset management plans that included a lot of the rail infrastructure. And so that has really helped that industry mature. I think MTA has done a great job at really kind of ramping up that conversation and that team and that data analysis over the last couple of years, but it's really maturing.
Okay. So going forward then, we're going to see more of an equality between system preservation for the roads and for transit. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying, ma'am.
Okay.
I will tell you that, I'm a fix it first kind of guy. I think taking care of our system is our core responsibility, both highway, transit, Port of Baltimore, BWI Marshall Airport, MVA, which includes our facilities, those types of things. And so I'm going to continue to expand that and do the best we can. Our first time this year, actually, I think it was included in the governor's budget notes that We were almost exactly 50-50 on kind of highway and transit this year, but you know, it's not something that that we can deal with in one budget or even two budgets. It's something we're going to have to deal with over several budgets.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Delegate Kittleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been sparring with our chairman over the years on transit, quote, versus roads, which I don't think is a good comparison. I don't dislike transit. I think it serves a very great purpose, and I enjoy riding it. And I apologize for beating a dead horse, but I have to say that what I don't like is MTA. 18 years ago, when Bob Flanagan and I walked into the MDOT and assumed responsibility, the wheels were falling off the buses. Not a good sign. And apparently for 18 years, it has continued to be incapable of maintaining itself. And having been on the inside, I know what some of those problems have been. I don't know if they continue to be, and I won't ask you all the details now. But this is it from July 2020. I have to read this to you because I don't want to see things like this. This is from a newspaper article. Over the years, MTA's poor maintenance practice, failure to upgrade existing infrastructure, and the overall culture of neglect has repeatedly received media attention. According to the Federal Transit Administration, MTA vehicles break down far more frequently compared to comparable vehicles in other cities. In addition, a third-party review of Baltimore's subway system from 2018 found faults with MTA's approach to track inspections, maintenance, including poor communication, lack of expertise, insufficient use of technology, and failure to follow industry standards. And I say all of that because I just don't understand why it hasn't improved. It's not money. Money is important, but obviously it's not the be all end all. For 18 years, MTA has not been sitting there saying we need money for maintenance. There is a problem inherent in the system, and I just wonder, Mr. Secretary, what kind of confidence can you give me that you will actually make it so?
Well, let me first say that, you know, I'm not familiar with the press article that you're reading. I have heard that breakdown statistic. I've tried to understand that kind of statistic, but I haven't been able to kind of fully grasp kind of what it is in terms of the data. But what I can tell you is that, you know, a successful asset management program comes with a variety of different areas. You know, one of them is money, of course. The other one is industry capacity. Are we mentoring the right kind of industry to deliver the rail projects and the light rail projects and the heavy rail projects that we need? Do we have that workforce here? You know, you know, what is the ability of MTA to do, what's the size of a capital program that they can deliver? What kind of good data do we have on our system and condition, as well as a regression analysis and understanding kind of when that's going to get to a point where we need to make an investment? And that's where we're focused right now. I can tell you that, you know, I don't talk about myself a lot, but I am currently chairing for the National Academy of Sciences, the International Conference on Asset Management. It is my specialty, if I ever had a specialty, and that's what I'm trying to focus on across this department. You know, we had a berth at the Port of Baltimore, same issue. You know, it was 100 years old, and we're trying to, you put Band-Aids on it. You can't put Band-Aids on things forever. And so, you know, my focus is system preservation, and not just MTA, it's system preservation across the board, because we have to have really, really predictable funding levels at highways, at transit, at the airport. And that way you keep your industry capacity where it needs to be. And they have a predictable industry capacity. When you go up and down, you lose that critical workforce because they move on to find other things to do.
Can I just follow up? There is another issue that you haven't mentioned, and in it, I think MTA has a very similar problem to the Baltimore school system. When you, and I don't know who is managing MTA, but you have to have people in there who are capable of managing money and making decisions on operating and capital expense. And again, I say I don't know who it is, but I do know that it has been an issue. And part of that goes straight to the union contract. And I was curious if that same union contract is from the old Baltimore bus system is still in place, because that made it extraordinarily difficult to make any changes and make anything better.
Let me, and I know he's on the call, but I'm going to address your first question. The MTA administrator is a gentleman by the name of Kevin Quinn, who is one of the finest professionals I've ever worked with. Kevin and I were planning director together. He was a planning director at MTA. I was the planning director at State Highway. We worked on a lot of joint projects together when he was in the public sector and private sector. He is building.
Secretary, I absolutely did not intentionally malign him, because we have had some really great administrators, but on down the line, it's getting the organization to function.
Well, no, absolutely. And I think it's really, giving them the right tools to function, the right mentoring, the right budgets, the right training programs. I really feel like we're in the right direction right now across MTA. And they're really doing a lot of things in terms of rebuilding that next generation. I look at a lot across the board at all of our departments and look at, are we mentoring that next generation? And I would say MTA is probably in one of the strongest positions with that kind of next generation of strong transit professionals. And I think they're on the right track, but it's going to take some time.
Thank you, Secretary Slater. I'm going to ask a couple questions on different issues. I'm going to read something from your statement. I'm going to then read something from DLS AELR 2017, and then I'm going to go to an RFP. On page 3 in your statement, you say MDOT's track record shows a significant commitment to clean and renewable energy, climate change, greenhouse gas reduction, and cleaner transportation. Then I go to a DLS report from AELR from 2017, where you all had just moved 2 to 3 years in reference to our emissions testing for new vehicles. And what DLS interpret, they said MDOT interprets 23-207 to provide broad authorization for the adoption of regulation exempting certain vehicles or motor vehicles from emissions testing, including emissions based on model year. This is reasonable interpretation of subsection 23-207. However, to the extent that the General Assembly did not intend for this exemption to apply broadly, the regulations may not comply with the legislative intent of the law. Accordingly, DLS recommends that MDOT consider introducing legislation that would mitigate any ambiguity relative to the statutory requirement under subsection 23-202B that state emissions control program provide for biennial exhaust emissions tests for all vehicles of the 1977 model year and each model year thereafter. Secretary Slater, I look at an RFP that was put out January 29th, 2021 by MBA. And I'm going to go to page 3 of the RFP, or page 11 of the RFP. And it says the additional changes for this RFP include the exemption of the 6-year most recent model years of new vehicles, the adoption of OBD testing of heavy duty vehicles between 14,000 and 26,000 miles. Letter C, the new 6-year model year exemption will begin on day of the new contract. Model year exemptions may increase over the contract duration contingent on improvement in key programs. Knowing this information, Secretary Slater, with this RFP and knowing how DLS said that there was a gray area, could you comment on that?
Well, you're catching me a little bit kind of flat on my feet on this one, because I'm not familiar with that DLS report, but I'd be happy to dig into that report and that procurement and be able to respond to you in writing if that's helpful.
No problem. That would be very helpful. And just as a FYI, it was done by Jameson Lancaster. He's still here. He's over in JPR.
Okay.
Analyst was Eric Pierce at the time. And once again, this was in 2017 when they put that out.
Okay.
My second question deals with the MAA.
Mhm.
And I know that we're in COVID-19. Currently, we have a vendor contractor. And there was talk of a RFP being put out, and I'm just not sure whether the RFP is still being put out. And if you can comment on that.
Absolutely. It is being put out. It has been delayed a little bit. We are going to be going to the Board of Public Works for some extensions on some of the subtenants over there. And so what we've been trying to do is we're looking at about a 2-year recovery in the airline industry in terms of being able to come back. The concern right now was putting that RFP out right now would have kind of created a strange environment with people coming after it in a very challenging environment economically. So that procurement got delayed about a year. We're going to the board to extend the subtenants 2 years and then the main contractor 1 year so that there's some stability. We want to start that procurement for it's really kind of a management type agency there a year from now to be able to get that out. And so we have some of those going to the board next time. We're going to have some more going to the board the time after that. I've asked Executive Director Ricky Smith to engage some of the members of the General Assembly as well, and as well as engage the union, because that's one of the big concerns associated with that existing relationship, so that we can recompete that and make those commitments on the next time.
I appreciate that, and I won't belabor the committee with further questions on that specific subject, but I do think that it's an extensive amount of time. I'm under the assumption that it's an extensive amount of time, even after the RFP, for that new developer to come in. I'm not sure of that, but I will ask that the analysts get more answers in reference to that specific subject.
Absolutely.
If you can also talk about the MBE partner of the master developer contract, and whether you all are pursuing it at this moment, and if the RFP will be consistent of that inclusion.
I'm sorry, Senator, I lost you for a minute. Would you mind repeating that?
Yep. So in reference to the master development contract, there's an expectation for MBE partner. I'm not sure if you could speak to whether you all are doing it at this moment or if you all pursue to do that with the new RFP coming out.
My thought was doing that with my current thought is what we do that with the new one.
Got it, but it's not happening as of this moment, right?
Right, not right at this moment.
Okay. My last question is for my friend in Howard County. It looked like they are concerned with Route 32.
Okay.
And it looked like Route 32 coming to a close, Secretary Slater, in reference to the work that's going on. She talked about it being a $126 million project, but they were concerned about the bike lanes in that specific area with Maryland 32. And just speak to that piece of it, because they're under the assumption in Howard County that wasn't taking place. And I don't know if you have an expectation for that to take place, but any comments will be very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have 2 projects. One just finished up. The second one is under construction now on Maryland 32. One was kind of 108 to Linden Church. The second one is kind of Linden Church all the way up. There are certain portions of 32 that have bike prohibitions, but it is our kind of policy goal to, anytime we can accommodate bikes and add those facilities as part of a larger capital project, we do that. There is a pretty extensive bike commute down towards Fort Meade. It seems to be growing certain times of the year. And they have a very active cycling group down there that we want to make sure that we accommodate as best we can.
Secretary Slater, just a comment. I know that our friends in Howard County are concerned about this. So if you can huddle with them, that would be great. Appreciate it. I'm going to swing it to you, Delegate Corman, and then we'll swing back. I think my friend Senator Edwards had a question. So Delegate Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Delegate Lewis.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary Slater, for your thoroughness with your answers. I'm trying not to repeat any my colleagues have already asked. One of the ones I talked to DLS staff about this a little bit earlier. I've been in communication with a number of local bus operators who were in smaller jurisdictions, so they didn't receive a direct resources from the CARES Act, like let's say some of the larger counties. And many of them told me that they reached out to NDOT in the state for some relief, and they weren't able to receive it. So I want to know if you could speak on that first before I get to the other questions I had.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you. Yes, they were a group that was hit relatively hard. And in fact, one of the members of our industry that we lost early on was one of our commuter bus operators. And so we have been unable to help them at some point, but there is money in the latest round of relief in terms of the acts. It's not in the Department of Transportation's budget. It's actually in Commerce's budget to provide that direct support to businesses.
That would include these local commuter operators.
Yeah, there were these kind of local commuter bus operators, so they do two things. One is they provide commuter service for us and local governments, but they also do like day trips and those types of things. And all of that essentially just shut down in this pandemic.
Okay, so sorry, I'd be clear. So then are you saying in Commerce budget, they have money set aside specifically for them, or that they could be potentially benefited from the money that Commerce has?
Specifically set aside. I was just on a call about this the other day, but it's specifically set aside. I believe it's in some of the relief acts. I'll have to confirm to you whether it's the federal relief act that was just passed or the one that's being debated in the state legislature today, but it's direct relief to private commuter bus operators through the Department of Commerce's budget.
Got it. There are a number of small and minority owned commuter bus operators. I'd be very happy to hear that, and I appreciate being able to let them know that. My other question has to deal with the vehicle emissions inspection program. Just made aware that there's been some regulatory changes to exempt all cars from testing until they are at least 7 years old, and there's some concerns about air quality there. Can you speak to the reason for moving it back from, I think, being 3 years old to 7 years old?
Yeah, that question relates directly to the one that Senator McCray raised as well. And so I'm going to have to kind of circle back on you with that one when I connect with Administrator Nizer, as well as I want to go back and read that DLS report and understand that better. But I'll be happy to provide an answer in writing on that one.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity.
Great. Just for everybody's benefit, it's the State Senate Relief Act bill that has a specific set aside. I don't know the total number for those commuter bus routes, just for everyone's clarity. Delegate Beitzel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Slater, I want to personally thank you for the effort and work and your leadership in moving the 219 North project ahead and working with Pennsylvania and with our legislators to get funding in place to finish that project up. It's there's work ongoing out there, and we really appreciate your leadership and working on that project and moving it forward. I have a question for you on the Cap and Invest program. Maybe could you explain maybe a little more fully what the intent of that program is and why maybe it has been delayed? I mean, why you haven't entered into that agreement? And what kind of revenue is expected from that, the impact on diesel fuel and gasoline prices, and how will you use the revenue if and when you get into that program?
Sure, absolutely. So the Cap and Invest program, what it does is it puts a cap on the fuel wholesalers in terms of how they can how much they can consume and burn and sell and all that, and the impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And so what that is what the intent of that is to take that and fund projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They could be transit projects, they could be bike and pedestrian projects. There's a strong equity component to the program and in kind of righting some wrongs in transportation. But the idea is to get away from kind of that motor fuel tax piece in more of a cap and invest program where you're putting a cap on the wholesale fuel suppliers and then making that investment back on the back end for reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, just kind of follow up on a similar question. Obviously, we're moving forward with a lot of initiatives to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to go away from carbon fuels. And this seems to be one of those things that maybe pushes quicker into that direction. The problem, and obviously one of the big solutions is the desire to get more and more electric vehicles on the highway. So no carbon emissions at all. But when you put electric vehicles on the highway, and the faster and the quicker we go in that direction, a lot of your program's funding all comes from gasoline and fuel taxes. So by going to that, do you have any indication or any thoughts about how we're going to fund projects going forward, especially when more and more of the transportation trust funds are being used for mass transit? How are we going to fund the improvements, maintenance, and of our highways?
You know, there are a number of scenarios being debated. I mean, vehicles today are much more fuel efficient than they were 10 years ago, and they're going to continue to do that. There's some major auto manufacturers that are really committed to jumping in with zero emission vehicles and having that be their business model. That's the direction that the state is going. There'll be a number of policy debates in terms of how we pay for transportation infrastructure, system preservation, those types of things. But there's also the transit investment is an important part of reducing that vehicle miles traveled to be able to create that in conjunction with land use. So, you know, if we're making transit investments that support our land use goals locally, then you're going to be able to reduce that vehicle miles traveled and then reduce those greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. I can tell you that I just moved to a condo personally, and my wife told me she hadn't started her car in a week the other day. So it's just where we're all headed as an industry. But there's a lot of industry discussions about that. There's a lot of models out there that are being looked at, whether it's a sales tax model, whether it's a vehicle miles traveled model, whether it's those are all being debated, and frankly will be the subject of some pretty tough debate over the next couple of years. I do think that, and I'm probably going to stir it up a little bit with this, but I do think that the federal government will probably debate this issue relatively soon.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to ask those questions.
Great. Chair McCray, do you have anybody on your side before I ask my questions?
I believe so. Senator Edwards, I think you have a question. Senator Edwards.
Well, I didn't, but I do.
You just muted yourself.
I just want to second what Delegate Beitzel said about the Secretary. We appreciate your interest in our neck of the woods and what you've done to help transportation out, not only building a first major road construction, what I'll call it, since the late 60s, early 70s, but also in the safety issues, which we have a big interest in with reflectors and all that kind of stuff on the roads and looking at different approaches to that. But I would ask my chairman, we had a subcommittee meeting the other day on, I don't know the correct terminology, autonomous transportation and personal, I'm going to call it personal people movers as a future way. And you can size these different sizes and build them a lot cheaper than you can build light rail, heavy rail, or whatever. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm sure our staff kept all the information on a computer. I'm not sure I can find it on mine, but if you could have them pull up that information, maybe send it to the secretary to look at. So when State Highway comes in, maybe that's something we can discuss when we meet on that, at least have the department look at that approach to something in the future, maybe trying to do a pilot project over in Chairman's neck of the woods, which was one of them that was mentioned, to see how it may or may not work in relation to cost, but also efficiency of the operation. So, Mr. Chairman, if you could ask staff to pull that up, maybe you could flip it over to Secretary Slater, that'd be good.
Yep, and thank you, Senator Edwards. I know that Peter James has been in constant contact with Administrator Quinn, so I know that they're make sure they get the presentation that he had at our briefing too. Chair McCormick.
Thank you, Chair McCray. Mr. Secretary, first of all, really appreciate your commitment to multimodalism, including what you said at the beginning about recognizing that frankly, the people who set public policy for the state of Maryland talk to you about more transit, and you respond to that. Appreciate your collaboration in general, and I also appreciate that you're a person of your word. When the budget was bad and the draft CTP came out, you told people in Montgomery County that Montgomery Hills was next if the money was available. More money was available when the final CTP came out, and you put Montgomery Hills in, and I really appreciate that. Appreciate the rest of your team as well, including Administrator Quinn. I hardly recognize him today because this isn't his usual bicycle background, but I think that's still him. So, and of course, all the others who are on as well, Jacqueline Hartman, Heather, and everybody else. And of course, we'll get the other modal heads in a few weeks. I do have a few questions. I'm going to start with the really easy one. Exhibit 1 of the analysis is taken from your website. It's actually something you drew my attention to back at the beginning of the pandemic. It sort of shows what things look like versus a normal year, what if we're ever going to have one of those again. How is the statewide weekly traffic bar measured? What is that? How are you measuring that?
So two sources of data. One is we have a partnership with Waze and INRIX for some of our probe-based data. And then we have ATR, we have traffic counters across the region. And then you essentially, I wouldn't say it's an exact science, but what I would say is that we take that as an average and kind of extrapolate that throughout the state.
Great. I use chart.maryland.gov and check your cameras all the time, but obviously that's sort of just an anecdotal, what does it look like, not quantitative the way this is. And so it's really interesting to see. So I'm going to jump to the issues. Issue 2, no shock. I want to talk to you about the P3 agreement. First of all, I would appreciate a little bit of clarity. It's early February. My understanding was the phase developer agreement. I'm sure I'm butchering that term, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. Winner was going to be announced in early February. So when is that going to be announced?
So, the team was still deliberating. We have some time set up where they're supposed to make a staff recommendation. When they do that, then what we'll do is take that recommendation and then we'll move forward on that point. But, I don't want them to rush it. I want them to really go through the analysis. We have a team of about 50 people that are doing the analysis from a variety of different perspectives, looking at the bids come in 2 different areas. One is the technical piece. So you analyze the technical areas of what that community partnership looks like. What are their methods for trying to minimize some of those impacts and those types of things. And then you open the financials. You don't open the financials until you review and rate the technical proposals. Then you look at the collective piece and then they make a staff recommendation to an executive committee.
Okay, so early February to me, because it's 28 days, is Valentine's Day or sooner. Is that still the schedule?
I would say we could probably expect it sometime mid-February.
Okay, is that the 12th through the 19th?
Yes.
Okay.
No, well, I would say, trying to think about what today's date is, the 4th. I would think, sometime over the next 2 weeks. So sometime between.
So sometimes I'm trying to get you to commit to something, but right now I'm really just trying to get a sense of the timing. I'm not asking you to write blood the day. I'm just trying to get some kind of sense here.
No, absolutely. I'm hesitant to kind of make a hard confirmation on a date because I don't want to put the team on a clock to feel like they have to rush an analysis.
Well, I don't want them to rush. April or May is still the expected timeline for the Board of Public Works for that agreement?
Correct.
Okay. Now you recall, well, maybe you don't recall. I spend a lot more time thinking about you than you probably thinking about me. But back in January of 2020, you and I had an exchange in the Environment and Transportation Committee. And I said to you, there will be no contract submitted to the Board of Public Works for the final award until the EIS is complete. And you responded yes.
Yes.
So what are you submitting to the Board of Public Works in April or May?
We're submitting a developer contract. And then that developer will go out with us and work collaboratively with the agencies and the community to get that final footprint. And then we'll be back to the board for that final contract, which we were always defining as construction. So the final construction contract. So the contract that will go to the board in April, May will not result in any shovel in the ground of any transportation solution.
Okay, just to be clear, when you say we were defining it that way, that we is not you and I, that's you and MDOT.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Okay. I sometimes, lose scope of this project. So for example, I've often said it was always going to be 2 new lanes in each direction. That's not really true. It's going to be two toll lanes in each direction, but for 270, at least according to the preferred alternative, it's going to be repurposing 2 lanes, 2 HOV lanes, closing the general purpose traffic that's HOV, still allowing HOV 3 plus toll payers. So I just want to make sure that I'm not losing something you're saying in perfect clarity and scope of the project. I've heard you say a few times in the recent past, including at this hearing, that what this project development agreement, and forgive me if I'm using the wrong term, covers is the bridge and 270 South. Now I think you mean at least the bridge, the spur, and then 270 South, because you got to get from the bridge to 270 South.
Correct.
I know that's true. Does it also include north of 370? Because when I look at the RFP fact sheet, that is all phase 1. It's phase 1 south, phase 1 north. Maybe I'm screwing up my terminology here, but the product development agreement covers all of phase 1. Is that correct?
Correct. So the project development agreement that's out there today that we'll be landing on in the next couple of weeks and taking to the board in April, May, covers the GW Parkway in Virginia, across the American Legion Bridge, up the split, all the way to Frederick.
Okay.
And so the phase 1 south is where we were focused, which really is 370 south. The part of 270 that's 370 north, that has not yet started that official NEPA process. So that will have to take a couple of years to develop. I do think, there are a lot of things that can happen in between there, and what that looks like, we don't know, but I don't want to predetermine NEPA, but that part of the corridor offers a lot of opportunities for things like reversibles and those types of things. Phase 1 south, for the most part, is largely within that pavement footprint that's out there today, with the exception of some strips, because you have that collector distributor lane piece. So you have 3 or 4 shoulders that you're kind of working and those types of things. But it doesn't offer any displacements, and it offers a lot of benefit. And in my mind, it offers us an opportunity to replace the American Legion Bridge and kind of address that bottleneck, and then see what works for us.
Yeah. So you're committing to a private partner at the Board of Public Works in April or May for the stretch that's north of 370 that the formal NEPA process hasn't even commenced on yet.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you for that clarity. I appreciate it. My second question is about some of these debt issues. And I just want to be really clear that I'm not opposed to this kind of flexible financing. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's just a question of some of the details. So on the Garvey bonds, obviously I'm very familiar with the ICC, what I'll call a one-off, where the department, back when you were at SHA, I think even then, because you've been doing this a long time, came to the legislature and asked for a specific authorization for Garvey bonds for the ICC, which was approved. Have there been other circumstances where the department has come to the legislature for a Garvey authorization and not been approved?
I'm going to have to ask Jacqueline to confirm that, but I believe the answer is no. I don't know that. I think we used them on the ICC. We wanted to make sure that they were a successful model for us, and we feel like they were, and we wanted to come back as a tool for us. We don't have anything specific in mind for Garvey bonds at this point. This is just more about kind of the tool.
Yeah, I think it's, my colleague Delegate Beitzel, I'm not sure if he's still, yeah, there he is constantly talking about the need to come up with innovative ways to finance transportation. This is a way to stretch dollars further. I would just question if we should go the route of the general authorization versus working together on the projects. On the revenue back debt at MTA, you and I spoke about this by phone as well, so I don't want to go on about it too long, but I appreciate that the bond market is very interesting right now, and lots of money is sloshing around looking for things to buy. But I'm also concerned that the airport is in a lot of trouble. And I appreciate the need to delay the sort of Fraport expiration. It would be a troubling time to go to the market. But you're not just delaying the expiration of that agreement. You've also worked out with them, and really Ricky Smith has worked out with them and done a fair job, reductions in what they're going to owe the state. And that's because of how soft the airport is in the airport market. So I just want to make sure, other than your great in-house team, have people looked at this financing to make sure this is really a sensible time for us to be issuing debt? And I just want to give you a parallel example. It's not your wheelhouse, but we have an entity called Medco in the state, the Maryland Economic Development Company, that among its other responsibilities owns student housing. Students were all sent home, and I'm simplifying here, and they were still trying to collect rent from those students because they said they had to service these bonds. I want to make sure that 2 years from now, if we're on variant XYZ of COVID and the airport is still soft, we're not going to be up a creek trying to service these bonds. I mean, I just want to make sure this has been thought about, not just in the sense of the bond market is hot, people will buy them, but how we're going to service them.
Sure. No, absolutely fair question, and one that I was asking as well, because we're looking at 2-year recovery on this market. The good thing is, and then I'm going to ask Jacqueline Hartman to weigh in a little bit because she was doing some of the market sounding and may have additional detail. The interesting thing with BWI Marshall Airport is we're a much heavier market airport for leisure travel than we are business travel. The projections are showing that the business travel market is going to come back at a much slower pace if it comes back to where it was at all. I mean, I think the fact that everybody's on these Zoom calls and team calls are really going to reduce business travel, but our leisure travel market is really taking off. And so we were in a much stronger position than some of our other counter airports. But Jacqueline, are you on? Maybe you talk a little bit about the market sounding that we did and those discussions.
Sure, absolutely. Jacqueline Hartman, Chief Financial Officer for the Maryland Department of Transportation. So we have already gone and received our credit ratings for the upcoming refunding sale. This is not a new money sale, but we are doing a refunding sale. We received ratings of, let's see, AA from Fitch and an A+ from Moody's, I believe. I can confirm that with you. We did run a number of scenarios, as did the credit rating agencies, to kind of measure, if the airport recovery looks as we think it will versus if it takes a more negative and slower recovery route. And under all of those scenarios, we still were able to maintain coverage and we'll still be able to pay the bonds.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. That's it. See, that wasn't so bad.
No.
Chair McCray stepped out of the frame, but I don't see any other questions from my colleagues. Everybody good? Okay, colleagues, we do have some advocacy witnesses who have signed up to testify who I think are still with us. We have, I believe, Eric Norton from the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance and Josh Tolkien from the Sierra Club. So Eric and Josh, our counsel, Ken Weaver, is going to tell you how long you have. I don't have that off the top of my head.
Yes, gentlemen, you have 2 minutes.
All right, I will.
And it looks like Eric would be up first.
Sure, that's fine. Thank you very much. And I will be as quick as possible because I appreciate y'all hanging in there. My name is Eric Norton. I'm the Director of Policy and Programs with the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. We're a nonprofit that advocates for improvements to the region's transportation system so that it better serves people and businesses. And we're also part of the Save Maryland Transit Coalition that you've probably heard in support of a bill before you that Delegate Kittleman mentioned. But this is, as the MDOT budget overview hearing, I wanted to use this as an opportunity to highlight what we see, and you have all been talking about, Delegate Kittleman and Delegate Krim, about sort of deficiencies in MDOT's budgeting on preservation, system preservation, state of good repair. And just quick background, in 2018, you all, the General Assembly passed a bill and Governor signed that required MTA to do a capital needs inventory. And the inventory was meant to take a holistic look at all the capital assets that the state owns through MTA, assess its conditions, project how much it would cost to properly maintain and repair those assets over the next 10 years. And in summer of 2019, MTA did that, published it, and found that there was a $2 billion gap between how much work they needed to do and how much they anticipated in their budget, looking out 10 years. So just to reiterate, this is funding just to do basic safety and maintenance of existing assets already owned by the state. And it would also chip away at an existing $1.7 billion backlog of maintenance that's already been deferred. But even knowing this and knowing our transit system suffer from high breakdown rates that were also referenced, MDOT's still been consistently funding MTA's capital budget below that needed level. So that means that $1.7 billion backlog gets bigger, not smaller. And Secretary Slater has told you that he's very focused on getting state of good repair, prioritizing the capital budget where it needs to be for transit and the other business units, which is great. But from what we can tell from the outside and in trying to analyze MDOT's budgets as best we can, they're still falling short of that goal. And as Secretary Slater also said, state of good repair means pay now or pay more later. And he gave a leaky roof example. This was a transportation hearing, so I had a transportation analogy teed up, which was you can put off changing the oil in your car, but if you do that long enough, eventually you're going to pay a heck of a lot more to replace the engine that you just burned out. So I really appreciate that you all are focused on this, and you talked about a lot this hearing, getting the department to focus more on state of good repair. And I hope the committee or both committees will use their oversight to prioritize asset management across the department. And just real quickly, one thought to do that is you may want to include working with MDOT to adopt a clear definition of what projects are really just system preservation and what are system preservation but actually have new capacity in there. And if you get a clear definition of that, you'll be able to better understand what your state of good repair needs are. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I appreciate all the work y'all are doing.
Thank you, Mr. Norton. Mr. Tolkien.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to say this, Mr. Chairman McCray, Mr. Chairman Corman, Madam Chair. I've never addressed multiple chairs in the same committee before. My name is Josh Tolkien. I'm the director of the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club. We're also a member of the Save Maryland Transit Coalition, which consists of over 70 groups: transportation, environment, workforce development, disability rights, faith, and social justice organizations. We're testifying here today to draw your attention to several key points about the transportation budget and also about the intersection of the transportation budget and these issues. Transportation is the largest source of climate pollution in Maryland. Transit is one of the win-win situations where we know investing in transit results not just in improved transportation, but also economic and environmental benefits. Bringing that lens in when reviewing the transportation budget will allow us to identify this not just as an isolated transportation issue, but as a key factor in shaping our air pollution, water pollution, economic development, quality of life. Many of the points that I was planning to say have been made by previous speakers, including Secretary Slater, about the importance of you either pay now or you pay later. This hearing today, I think, has been honest about the fact that there has been historic underfunding of MTA, and we're pleased to see that the funding for MTA in the next couple years begins to get at the historic funding inequities. I do believe, though, that the previous decades have demonstrated that it is dangerous and undependable to have the funding for MTA's maintenance be able to shift with whatever the political winds might be, and that for the dependability and the reliability of the MTA system and the ridership and the confidence it builds, I think that having a committed fund will be critical. I wanted to remind folks that several years ago, this body made a strong commitment to help the WMATA system when the WMATA system was in need of critical funding. But at that same time, there was a major breakdown in the metro system in Baltimore. This bill will benefit the whole state, but it also will make essential investments in the infrastructure that serves the greater Baltimore area. And for reasons of statewide equity, I think we need to be looking at long-term maintenance investments in MTA. Lastly, I do want to draw attention to some concern areas, particularly around the I-270 and 495 expansion project. There is roughly $50 million in engineering contracts that have been billed as having zero cost to taxpayers because they will all be paid back by an eventual contractor. I think that the challenges with the Purple Line contract, P3, as well as the major changes in this project should make everyone skeptical about a future promise of paying back a sum as large as $50 million, and that any additional funding of this project is viewed as an actual expense and is really analyzed critically. We believe that this conversation and the values brought forth in this hearing have sort of identified a lot of the key environmental and economic issues, and we're just excited to be part of these continuing conversations about the budget to help highlight the areas where there's a key environmental or economic benefit that we think really deserves extra attention. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Tolkien. At this moment, I just want to see if there are any questions from the committee. Seeing no questions, just want to thank you for your advocacy, both you and Mr. Norton. At this moment, before we go and leave, I just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Slater, for your service to Marylanders. I know that I say that on behalf of myself and Chairman Corman, and we feel the same. And Mr. McCullough, our budget analyst, very thorough budget analyst. I just want to say thank you for your work, and it is much appreciated. Let me tell you, it's been a great joy to be able to chair this meeting amongst the House and the Senate. And at this moment, just want to conclude this budget hearing. First, I want to see my colleague before I conclude. Chairman Corman, is there anything that you want to say?
No, it's just great to have you even partially back in the House, Senator McCray.
Well, with that comment, I just want to say thank you all again, and this meeting is adjourned.